I watched political developments after the Austrian Anschluss from a point far from the centre of military affairs. At the beginning of February 1938, after I had risen to the second most senior post on the German army staff, that of Oberquartiermeister, the deputy to the Chief of Staff, my career as a General Staff officer had abruptly ended. When Colonel General Baron versus Fritsch was eliminated as Commander-in-Chief of the Army through a diabolical party intrigue, a number of his closest collaborators, myself included, had been removed from the Army High Command, OKH, along with him. Since then, as Commander of 18 Division, I had naturally ceased to be informed of matters falling within the High Command's jurisdiction. Indeed, since the beginning of April 1938, I had been able to devote myself entirely to my job as a divisional commander. It was a particularly satisfying task, even more satisfying in those years than at any other time, but it also called for every ounce of one's energy, since the expansion of the army was still far from complete. The continual formation of new units entailed a constant reorganization of those already in existence, while the speed of rearmament, and especially the attendant growth of both the officer and non-commissioned officer corps, meant that the most exacting demands were made on commanders at all levels if we were to fulfill our aim of creating intrinsically stable and highly trained troops who would guarantee the security of the Reich. To succeed in this work was more gratifying still, especially in my own case, now that, after several years in Berlin, I once again had the pleasure of being in direct touch with combat units. It is with immense gratitude, therefore, that I remember that last year and a half of peace, and, in particular, the Silesians of whom 18 Division was largely composed. Silesia had produced good soldiers from time immemorial, so the military education and training of the new units was a rewarding task. It is true that the brief interlude of the Floral War, the occupation of the Sudetenland, had found me in the post of Chief of Staff of the Army commanded by Colonel General Ritter versus Lieb. As such, I had learned of the conflict that had broken out between the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Beck, and Hitler over the Czech question, and which, to my intense regret, had ended with the resignation of the Chief of Staff I so revered. This resignation, however, snapped the thread which had kept me in touch with OKH, and so it was not until summer 1939 that I learned of Operation Order White, the first offensive deployment against Poland to be prepared on Hitler's orders. No such thing had existed before the spring of 1939. On the contrary, all military preparations on our eastern frontier had been based on defence. In the above Operation Order, I was earmarked as Chief of Staff of Southern Army Group, the Commander-in-Chief of which was to be Colonel General Verser Rundstedt, then already living in retirement. It was planned that this army group should deploy in Silesia, eastern Moravia, and partly in Slovakia, in accordance with the detailed arrangements which we were now to work out. As the Army Group headquarters did not exist in peacetime and would be set up only in the event of general mobilization, a small working party was formed to deal with the new operation order. It assembled on 12th of August 1939 in the Silesian training area of Neuhammer. It was to work under the direction of Colonel Blumentritt, a General Staff officer who was destined to become the Army Group's Chief of Operations, IA, on mobilization. This was an unusual stroke of luck as far as I was concerned, for my relationship with that exceptionally able man was one of the closest confidence. The bond had been forged while we were both serving at the headquarters of V. Lieb's army during the Sudeten crisis, and I considered it extremely valuable to have a colleague on whom I could rely in times like these. As often as not, the things that attract us to another person are quite trivial, and what always delighted me about Blumentritt was his fanatical attachment to the telephone. The speed at which he worked was in any case incredibly high, but whenever he had a receiver in his hand, he could deal with whole avalanches of queries, always with the same imperturbable good humour. In mid-August, the future commander of Southern Army Group, Colonel General Verser Rundstedt, arrived at Neuhammer. Everyone among us knew him. As an exponent of grand tactics, he was brilliant, a talented soldier who grasped the essentials of any problem in an instant. Indeed, He would concern himself with nothing else, being supremely indifferent to minor detail. He was a gentleman of the old school, a type, I fear, which is now dying out, but which once added a delightful variant to life. The general had a charm about him to which even Hitler succumbed. The latter seemed to have taken a genuine liking to him, and, surprisingly enough, there was even a glimmer of this left after he had twice dismissed him. What probably attracted Hitler was the indefinable impression the general gave of a man from a past which he did not understand, and to the atmosphere of which he never had access. As a matter of interest, when our working party assembled at Neuhammer, my own 18 Division was also in the training area for the annual regimental and divisional exercises. That everyone among us, disquieted by the number of emergencies through which the fatherland had passed since 1933, wondered where all this would lead, I need hardly say. Our thoughts and private conversations at this time were centred on the signs of the gathering storm on the horizon around us. We realised that Hitler was fanatically resolved to dispose of the very last of the territorial problems Germany had inherited through the Treaty of Versailles. We knew that he had begun negotiations with Poland as far back as autumn 1938 to clear up the whole Polish-German frontier question, though what progress, if any, these negotiations had made we were not told. At the same time, we were aware of the British guarantee to Poland, and I can safely say that not one of us in the army was so arrogant, thoughtless, or short-sighted as not to recognise the deadly seriousness of the warning that guarantee implied. This factor alone, though it was not the only one, convinced our party in Neuhammer that there would in the end be no war. Even if the deployment plan on which we were now engaged went into operation, that still need not, in our opinion, mean war. We had watched Germany's precarious course along the razor's edge to date with close attention, and were increasingly amazed at Hitler's incredible luck in attaining, hitherto without recourse to arms, all his overt and covert political aims. The man seemed to have an almost infallible instinct. Success had followed success in a never-ending progression, if one may initially refer to the glittering train of events that ultimately led to our downfall as successes. All those things had been achieved without war. Why, we asked ourselves, should it be different this time? Look at Czechoslovakia. Though Hitler had drawn up a menacing array of troops against her in 1938, there had still been no war. Yet the old adage about taking the pitcher to the well once too often still echoed in our ears, for the position was now a much trickier one, and the game Hitler seemed intent on playing had a more dangerous look about it. There was the British guarantee to contend with this time. But then we recalled Hitler's assertion that he would never be so mad as to unleash a war on two fronts, as the German leaders of 1914 had done. That at least implied that he was a man of reason, even if he had no human feelings left. Raising that coarse voice of his, he had explicitly assured his military advisers that he was not idiot enough to bungle his way into a world war for the sake of Danzig or the Polish corridor. Poland was bound to be a source of great bitterness to us after she had used the dictated Peace of Versailles to annex German territories, to which neither historical justice nor the right of self-determination gave her any claim. For us soldiers, she had been a constant cause of distress in the years of Germany's weakness. Every time we looked at the map, we were reminded of our precarious situation, that irrational demarcation of the frontier, that mutilation of our fatherland, that corridor whose severance of East Prussia from the Reich gave us every reason to fear for that lovely province. For all that, however, the army had never dreamt of fighting an aggressive war against Poland to end this state of affairs by force. Apart from anything else, such forbearance had a perfectly simple military reason. Any attack on Poland would have plunged the Reich into a war on two or more fronts, and with this it could never have coped. In the period of weakness imposed on us at Versailles, we had always had the cauchemar de coalition, a nightmare that disturbed us all the more whenever we thought of the aspirations for German territory still harboured with such ill-concealed longing by wide circles of the Polish people. Yet although we had no wish to fight an aggressive war, we could hardly hope, even taking the most unprejudiced view of the Polish mentality, to sit down peacefully at the same table as the Poles to revise those senseless frontiers. Neither did it seem beyond the bounds of possibility that Poland might herself take the initiative one day and set out to solve the frontier question by force. We had gained some experience in this respect since 1918, and in Germany's years of weakness it had been just as well to be prepared for such a thing. Once Marshal Pilsudski's voice was silent, and certain nationalist circles had gained a decisive influence in Poland, an incursion into East Prussia or Upper Silesia was just as feasible as the Polish raid on Vilna before it. For that contingency, though, our military deliberations had found a political answer. If Poland were proved to be the aggressor and we succeeded in warding off the attack, the Reich might well have an opportunity to get the unhappy frontier question revised on the political rebound. At all events, there was no exaggerated wishful thinking on the subject on the part of any army leaders. Although General Wrz-Rabenau, in the book Siegt aus meinem Leben, quotes the Colonel General as saying that Poland's existence is intolerable and incompatible with Germany's essential needs, she must disappear through her own internal weakness and through Russia. With help from ourselves, this was in fact an attitude already overtaken by developments in the political and military fields. We had a pretty fair idea of the growing military power of the Soviet Union, and France, the land under whose spell one so easily fell, still faced us with the same hostility as ever. She would always seek allies in Germany's rear. But if the Polish state were to disappear, the mighty Soviet Union could become a far more dangerous ally of France than a buffer state like Poland was at present. Any elimination of the buffer formed by Poland and Lithuania between Germany and the Soviet Union could lead only too easily to differences between the two big powers. While it might be a matter of mutual interest to carry out frontier revisions vis-à-vis Poland, the complete removal of that state would hardly be to Germany's advantage in view of the entirely changed situation that now prevailed. So whether we liked her or not, it was preferable to keep Poland between us and the Soviet Union. Aggrieved though we were as soldiers by the senseless and explosive frontier demarcation in the east, Poland was still less dangerous as a neighbour than the Soviet Union. Like all other Germans, of course, we hoped a revision of the frontier would come about sometime and return the predominantly German-populated areas to the Reich in accordance with the natural right of their inhabitants. At the same time, it was most undesirable from the military point of view that the size of our Polish population should increase. As for the German demand for a union of East Prussia with the Reich, it could well have been harmonized with Poland's desire for a seaport of her own. This, and none other, was the trend of thought on the Polish problem favoured by the majority of German soldiers in the days of the Reichswehr. Let us say from the end of the 1920s onwards, whenever the question of armed conflict cropped up. Then the wheel of fate turned once again. Adolf Hitler appeared on the stage. Everything changed, including the basis of our relationship with Poland. The Reich concluded a non-aggression pact and treaty of friendship with our eastern neighbour. We were freed from the nightmare of a possible Polish attack. At the same time, relations between Germany and the Soviet Union cooled off, our new ruler having only too clearly voiced his hatred of the Bolshevik system in public speeches. Poland was bound to feel less constrained politically in consequence of this new situation, but that was no longer a danger as far as we were concerned. German rearmament and Hitler's series of successes in the field of foreign policy made it improbable that she would use her new freedom of action against the Reich, and when she proved only too ready to take a hand in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia, it seemed not unlikely that we could talk business about the frontier question. Until spring 1939 then, the High Command of the German Army never had any plan for offensive deployment against Poland on its files. Before that, all our military measures in the East had been purely defensive in character. Was it to be the real thing this time, in autumn 1939? Did Hitler really want war, or would he, as with Czechoslovakia in 1938, bring the very limit of pressure to bear, militarily and otherwise, to settle the Danzig and corridor questions, war or bluff? That was the question exercising the mind of everyone without any real insight into political developments, primarily into Hitler's own intentions. And who, for that matter, was vouchsafed any insight whatever into those intentions? At all events, it was entirely conceivable that the military measures taken in August 1939, despite Operation Order White, were directed towards increasing political pressure on Poland. Since the summer, on orders from Hitler, work had been proceeding at feverish speed on an Ostwall, an eastern equivalent of the Siegfried Line. Whole divisions, the 18th among them, were moved to the Polish frontier in constant rotation to work on this fortification for several weeks at a stretch. What was the point of all this effort if Hitler were going to attack Poland? Even if, contrary to all his assurances, he were contemplating a war on two fronts, the Ostwall would still have been quite out of place, since the only proper action for Germany in such circumstances would be to attack and overwhelm Poland first while remaining on the defensive in the west. The reverse solution, offensive action in the west and defensive measures in the east, was quite out of the question with the present ratio of forces, especially as neither plans nor preparations for an offensive in the west had been made. So if the construction of an Ostwall were to have any rhyme or reason in the present situation, it could surely only be to exert pressure on Poland by placing large troop concentrations on her frontier. Even the deployment of infantry divisions on the east bank of the Oder in the last 10 days of August, and the movement of the armoured and motorised divisions into assembly areas initially west of the river, need not really have been preparations for an attack. They could just as well have been a form of political pressure. Be that as it may, the peacetime training programme went on just as usual for the time being. On 13th and 14th August, I had my last divisional exercise at Neuhammer, winding up with a march past at which Colonel General versus Rundstedt took the salute. On 15th of August, there was a big artillery shoot in cooperation with the Luftwaffe. It was marked by a tragic accident. An entire dive bomber squadron, obviously wrongly informed about cloud altitude, failed to pull out of a dive in time and tore straight into a wood. There was one more regimental scheme the next day, and then the divisional units went back to their normal garrisons, though they were to leave for the Silesian frontier again only a few days later. On 19th August, versus Rundstedt and I received instructions to attend a conference at the Obersalzberg on the 21st. On 10th August, we drove from Liegnitz to my brother-in-law's estate near Linz and spent the night there, reaching Berchtesgaden the following morning. All the army group and army commanders and their chiefs of staff were reporting to Hitler, as well as the appropriate Navy and Luftwaffe leaders. The conference, or rather Hitler's address, as he was not going to let the occasion turn into an open discussion after his experience at a conference with the chiefs of staff the previous year, before the Czech crisis, took place in the big reception chamber of the Berghof that looked out towards Salzburg. Shortly before Hitler appeared, Göring came in. He was an extraordinary sight. Up till now, I had assumed that we were here for a serious purpose, but Göring appeared to have taken it for a masked ball. He was dressed in a soft-collared white shirt, worn under a green jerkin adorned with big buttons of yellow leather. In addition, he wore grey shorts and long grey silk stockings that displayed his impressive calves to considerable effect. This dainty hosiery was offset by a pair of massive laced boots. To cap it all, his paunch was girded by a sword belt of red leather richly inlaid with gold, at which dangled an ornamental dagger in an ample sheath of the same material. I could not resist whispering to my neighbour, General Vers Salmuth, "I suppose the fat boy's here as a strong-arm man?" Hitler's speech on this occasion was the subject of various prosecution documents at the Nuremberg trial. One of these asserted that he had indulged in the vilest of language, and that Göring, delighted at the prospect of war, had jumped on the table and yelled, "Sieg Heil!" All this is quite untrue. It is equally untrue that Hitler said anything about his only fear being a last-minute offer of mediation from some pig-dog or other. While the tone of his speech was certainly that of a man whose mind was firmly made up, he was far too good a psychologist to think he could impress a gathering of this kind with tirades or bad language. The substance of the speech has been correctly reported in Greiner's book Die Oberste Wehrmachtführung, 1939-43. This report is based on a verbal summary given to the author by Colonel Warlimont for inclusion in his war diary and on shorthand notes taken by Admiral Canaris. A certain amount of information on the speech may also be gathered from Colonel General Hyder's diary, although here too, as in the case of the statements made by Warlimont and Canaris, I feel a number of things may have been included which were actually heard from Hitler on other occasions. The impression left on those of us generals who did not belong to the top circle of military leaders was approximately this. Hitler was absolutely determined to bring the German-Polish question to a head this time, even at the price of war. If, however, the Poles were to give in to German pressure, now approaching its climax in the deployment, albeit still camouflaged, of the German armies, a peaceful solution still did not seem excluded, and Hitler was convinced that when it came to the point the Western powers would once again not resort to arms. He was at special pains to develop the latter thesis, his main arguments being the backwardness of British and French armaments, particularly with regard to air strength and anti-aircraft defence, the virtual inability of the Western powers to render Poland any effective help except by an assault on the Siegfried Line, a step which neither power was likely to risk in view of the great sacrifice of blood it would entail. The international situation, particularly the tension in the Mediterranean, which considerably reduced Britain's freedom of movement, the internal situation in France, and last but not least the personalities of the responsible statesmen. Neither Chamberlain nor Daladier, Hitler contended, would take upon themselves the decision to go to war. Logical and conclusive, though his appreciation of the Western powers' position appeared to be in many respects, I still do not think Hitler's audience was entirely convinced by his exposition. The British guarantee was certainly the only real obstacle to his designs, but it was nevertheless a pretty weighty one. What Hitler had to say about an eventual war with Poland could not, in my opinion, be interpreted as a policy of annihilation, which was the sense given to it by the Nuremberg prosecution. When Hitler called for the swift and ruthless destruction of the Polish army, this was, in military parlance, merely the aim that must be the basis of any big offensive operation. At all events, nothing he had said could give us any hint of how he was to treat the Poles later on. The biggest surprise, and also the deepest impression, was caused, quite naturally, by the announcement of the impending pact with the Soviet Union. On our way to Berchtesgaden, we had already read newspaper reports of the conclusion of an economic agreement, and that in itself was quite a sensation. Now we were told that Foreign Minister Verser-Ribbentrop, who was present at the conference and took leave of Hitler in our presence, was flying to Moscow to sign a non-aggression pact with Stalin. By this move, Hitler declared, he was depriving the Western powers of their trump card, for even a blockade of Germany would be ineffectual from now on. Hitler hinted that in order to facilitate the pact he had already made considerable concessions to the Soviet Union in the Baltic and in respect of Poland's eastern frontiers, but his remarks gave no reason for inferring that there would be a complete partition of Poland. Indeed, he is now known to have still been considering leaving a Polish rump state in existence even after the campaign had started. As a result of Hitler's address, neither Weser-Rundstedt nor I, and presumably none of the other generals either, concluded that war was now inevitable. Two factors in particular persuaded us that, as at Munich, there would be an 11th-hour settlement. The first was that the pact with the Soviet Union now rendered Poland's position hopeless from the start. If Britain, virtually deprived of the weapon of blockade, were compelled to take the bloody course of attacking in the West in order to aid Poland, it seemed likely enough that, under pressure from the French, she would advise Warsaw to give in. Similarly, it must henceforth be clear to Poland that the British guarantee was now practically inoperative. If it came to a war with Germany, moreover, she must expect the Russians to take action in her rear with a view to accomplishing their old demands on her eastern territory. What else could Warsaw do in this situation but give way? A further consideration was the conference we had just attended. What was its purpose? Hitherto, on the military side, the intention to attack Poland had been camouflaged in every possible way. The presence of divisions in the eastern areas had been explained by the construction of an eastern rampart, and to conceal the purpose of the troop movements to East Prussia, an enormous Tannenberg celebration had been arranged. Preparations for big motorized troop maneuvers had been going on until the very last moment. There had been no official mobilization. Though these measures could not possibly escape the notice of the Poles and were obviously intended as political pressure, they had still been enveloped in the greatest secrecy and accompanied by every form of deception. Yet now, at the very height of the crisis, Hitler had summoned every one of his senior commanders to the Obersalzberg, an action that could not possibly be concealed. To us, this seemed to be the climax of a policy of deliberate bluff. In other words, was Hitler not after all working for a settlement, despite his bellicose utterances? Was not this very conference meant to apply the final squeeze? Such were the thoughts of Colonel General Verser Rundstedt and myself as we left Berchtesgaden. While he travelled on ahead to our Nice headquarters, I stopped on in Liegnitz for a further day with my family. This alone was a measure of my inner disbelief in the likelihood of an imminent outbreak of war. At noon on 24th August, Colonel General Verser Rundstedt assumed command of the army group. On 25th August, at 3:25 in the afternoon, we received the following cipher message from the High Command of the Army. Operation Plan White, D-Day, Font 26.8, H-Hour, Franchouer 0430. So the decision to go to war, the decision we had not wanted to believe possible, had apparently been taken. I was at dinner with Colonel General Verser Rundstedt in our quarters at the Monastery of the Holy Cross in Nice, when the following order from the High Command came through by telephone. Do not, repeat, not, commence hostilities. Halt all troop movements. Mobilization to continue. Deployment for plans. White and West to proceed as scheduled. Every soldier can judge what an 11th-hour counter-order of this kind implied. Within the space of a few hours, 3 armies moving straight for the frontier across a zone extending from Lower Silesia to the eastern part of Slovakia had to be brought to a halt, not forgetting that all headquarters staffs up to at least divisional level were also on the march, and that there was still a security ban on wireless traffic. Despite all the difficulties, we managed to notify everybody in good time, a first-rate piece of work by the operations and signals staffs. Nevertheless, one motorized regiment in eastern Slovakia could only be stopped after an officer in a Fiesler Storch aircraft had landed at the head of the column in the darkness. We were not told Hitler's reasons for what seemed to be an 11th-hour reversal of his decision to fight. All we heard was that the negotiations were continuing. It will be appreciated that we as soldiers were considerably shaken by leadership of this kind. The decision to go to war is, after all, the gravest that a head of state ever has to take. How could any man reach such a decision and then cancel it again in the space of a few hours? Least of all when that cancellation placed him, in the military sense, at a severe disadvantage. As I pointed out above when describing the Obersalzberg conference, everything in the military sphere was aimed at taking the enemy by surprise. There was no public announcement of the mobilization, the first call-up being scheduled for 26th August, the day of the invasion that had this very moment been stopped. This meant that we were to march into Poland with nothing more than our sum total of armoured and motorized formations, plus a limited number of infantry divisions that were already in the frontier areas or in the process of being made immediately operational. There could be no question now of catching the enemy unawares, for even though the movement of troops into their final concentration areas behind the frontier was being carried out by night, it could certainly not elude the enemy's attention, particularly as the motorized units in assembly areas west of the Oder had to form up in daylight in order to cross the river. Consequently, if there really were to be war, the other alternative must now come into effect. invasion with all our mobilized forces. The element of surprise was lost in any case. As the original decision to start hostilities could not be regarded as an act of ill-considered frivolity on Hitler's part, we could only deduce that the whole thing was simply a continuation of diplomatic tactics to bring ever-increasing pressure to bear on the Poles. So when, at 1700 hours on 31st August, we received a fresh order, Dies Severave 1.9, H. 0445, Colonel General Vers Rundstedt and I were sceptical, particularly as no mention was made of the negotiations having failed. Within our own army group, at any rate, we were all set this time, in view of what had occurred on 25th August, to cope with another last-minute stoppage of the operation. The General and I stayed up till midnight in anticipation of the countermand we thought might still come through. Only when midnight had passed and the last possibility of halting the operation had gone could there be no further doubt left. From now on, the weapons would speak. The following factors were decisive in determining the strategic position in the Polish campaign. First, the superiority of the German forces, provided that the German leadership were prepared to accept a considerable risk in the West in order to commit the bulk of its strength against Poland. Secondly, the geographical situation, which enabled the Germans to take the Polish army in a pincer movement from East Prussia on one flank and Silesia and Slovakia on the other. Thirdly, the latent threat present in Poland's rear from the outset in the form of the Soviet Union. The German planners accepted the above-mentioned risk in the West to the full. OKH launched its attack against Poland with 42 divisions of regular troops, including one newly formed armoured division, 10 Panzer, and one new infantry division formed from fortress troops in the Oder water basin, the 50th. They consisted of 24 infantry divisions, 3 mountain divisions, 6 armoured divisions, 4 light divisions, 4 motorized infantry divisions, and 1 cavalry brigade. Then came 16 new divisions not formed until after the general mobilization and destined for use between the second and fourth waves. These could not initially be regarded as first-rate troops. Also assigned for the Polish campaign were the SS division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and 1 or 2 reinforced SS regiments. For the West, this left only 11 regular divisions, some fortress troops amounting to about a division in strength, later to be formed into 72 infantry division, and 35 newly constituted divisions of second to fourth line troops. No armoured or motorized troops were available. There was thus a total of 46 divisions, of which only 3/4 were conditionally fit to go into action. 22 Infantry Division, which had been trained and equipped as an airborne division, was retained at the disposal of OKH in the interior of the Reich. The bulk of our air forces were likewise committed against Poland in the form of 2 air fleets, a third, weaker one being kept in the west. The risks which the German leadership ran by distributing its forces in this way were undoubtedly very great indeed. Because of the unexpected brevity of the Polish campaign, a development due in part to the loser's own mistakes, and above all as a result of the complete inaction of Poland's Western allies at the time of her defeat, these risks have hardly ever been properly appreciated. It should be realized that at that particular juncture the German command had to reckon with a French army some 90 divisions strong. In autumn 1939, according to Vesey Tippelskirch, France actually raised 108 divisions in the space of 3 weeks. These consisted of 57 infantry, 5 cavalry, 1 armoured, and 45 reservist or territorial divisions, supported by strong army troops of tanks and artillery. It should be noted, however, that part of these forces remained in North Africa and on the Alpine frontier in the initial stages. Author. The last category had the advantage of being made up of fully trained reservists, whereas the new German formations consisted to a great extent of raw recruits or reservists from the First World War. There can be no doubt, then, that the French army far outnumbered Germany's forces in the West from the very first day. The British contribution of land forces, on the other hand, was quite insignificant. it amounted to a mere 4 divisions, and even these did not arrive until the first half of October. The basis of the German plan of operations against Poland was to make maximum use of the way the frontier ran in order to envelop the enemy from the start. Thus, the German armies deployed in 2 widely divided flank groups, which left the central sector, the Oder-Warta Basin, almost wide open. Northern Army Group, Commander Colonel General Vers Bock, Chief of Staff General versus Salmuth. Northern Army Group comprised 2 armies embracing a total of 5 infantry and 1 armoured corps. Under command of these were 9 regular infantry divisions, including the newly formed 50 Infantry Division, which consisted of fortress troops and was not up to strength, 8 infantry divisions established on mobilization, 2 armoured divisions, plus the newly formed tank task force Kemp, 2 motorized infantry divisions and 1 cavalry brigade, in all 21 divisions. Supplementing these in East Prussia were the fortress troops of Königsberg and Lotze, in Pomerania, the Netzer Brigade. 3rd Army deployed in East Prussia and 4th Army in East Pomerania. The task of the Army Group was to thrust through the Polish corridor, to throw the mass of its forces on the east of the Vistula towards the southeast or south, and then, after forcing the Narew line, to take any Polish defence of the Vistula from the rear. Southern Army Group, Commander Colonel General Verser Rundstedt, Chief of Staff General versus Manstein. Southern Army Group consisted of 3 armies: 14th, Colonel General List, 10th, Colonel General Verser Reichenau, and 8th, Colonel General Blaskowitz. In all, the Army Group had 8 infantry and 4 armoured corps, totalling 15 regular infantry divisions, 3 mountain divisions, 8 newly drafted divisions, and the bulk of the mechanised formations, 4 armoured, 4 light and 2 motorised infantry divisions. This made a total of 36 divisions. The Army Group deployed 14th Army in the Upper Silesian Industrial Region, Eastern Moravia and Western Slovakia, 10th Army in Upper Silesia around and to the south of Kreuzberg, and 8th Army in Central Silesia eastward of Oels. Its task was to defeat the enemy in the large bend of the Vistula and in Galicia, dash for Warsaw with strong motorised forces, taking the Vistula crossings as fast as possible on a broad front. In conjunction with Northern Army Group, destroy the remainder of the Polish army. Peacetime Poland had 30 infantry divisions, 11 cavalry brigades, 1 mountain brigade, 2 motorised armoured brigades. Additionally, there were a few Frontier Corps regiments and a large number of Home Defence (ON) battalions and naval troops stationed in the Gdynia Hel area. In other words, her aggregate strength was considerable. However, her weapons mainly dated from World War I, and her air force of some 1,000 aircraft was not up to modern standards. Germany had expected Poland to double the number of her divisions in the event of war, though it seemed doubtful whether the requisite arms were available. According to Wies Tippelkirch in his History of the Second World War, Poland drafted only enough regiments for 10 reserve divisions prior to the outbreak of hostilities, and even then, she apparently had no time to embody all of them in their scheduled divisions. Nevertheless, German intelligence did identify a number of reserve divisions in the course of the campaign. The Polish High Command disposed its forces as follows: deployed along the East Prussian frontier in front of the Bobonaro-Vistula line, a combat group of 2 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades between Suwałki and Tomza, the Modlin army of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades on both sides of Mlawa. In the corridor was the Pomorze army of 5 divisions and 1 cavalry brigade. Facing the German frontier from the Warta to the Slovakian frontier were 3 armies. The Poznan army, with a strength of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades in the western part of Poznan province. The Lodz army, 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades, around Wilun. The Krakow army, 6 divisions, 1 cavalry and 1 motorised brigade, between Czestochowa and Nowy Targ. Behind the 2 last-named armies was the Prussia army, 6 divisions and 1 cavalry brigade in the area Tomaszow-Kielce. Finally, the deep flank along the Carpathian frontier was to be covered by a Carpathian army composed mainly of reserve units and ON battalions in echelon formation. A reserve group, General Piskor's army, consisting of 3 divisions and 1 motorized brigade, remained on the Vistula in the area Modlin-Warsaw-Lublin. In the course of the campaign, an independent Policy group was formed east of the Bug, presumably for protection against Russia. In the event, the Polish deployment was still in progress when the German invasion started, and for this reason it was probably never properly completed in the form described above. It is difficult to decide the strategic aim of the Polish deployment unless it was based on a wish to cover everything and surrender nothing voluntarily. It was a policy that usually leads to the defeat of the weaker party. Hitler was to have a similar experience only a few years later, without ever learning his lesson from it. Now, the difficulty of Poland's strategic position was quite obvious, consisting as it did in the inferiority of the Polish forces and the fact that the line of the frontier enabled Germany to attack from 2, later even from 3, sides at once. So when the Polish High Command still could not resist trying to hold on to everything, this only went to show how difficult it is to reconcile psychological and political inhibitions with hard military fact. Apart from Marshal Pilsudski and 1 or 2 sober-minded politicians, probably no one in Poland ever quite realized in what a dangerous situation the country had landed itself by enforcing its unjustified territorial demands on the neighbouring states of Russia and Germany. Yet this same Poland numbered only 35 million inhabitants, of whom a mere 22 million were of Polish nationality, the rest belonging to the German, Ukrainian, White Russian and Jewish minorities, all of which had been oppressed to one degree or another. Besides, in their reliance on their French allies, people in Poland had undoubtedly spent far too long in the years of Germany's and the Soviet Union's military weakness, dreaming of a chance for aggression against the Reich. Some had dreamt of raids on isolated East Prussia, or, thanks to the propaganda of the Polish Insurgents League, on German Upper Silesia. Others had even considered a march on Berlin, either by the shortest route through Poznari and Frankfurt, or by first conquering Upper Silesia and then advancing on the capital west of the Oder. Admittedly, such dreams had been frustrated by Germany's fortification of East Prussia and the Oder water basin, and later by her rearmament. But it is unlikely that Poland's politicians and soldiers, banking on a simultaneous French offensive in the west, ever put such aggressive ideas right out of their minds. Defensive though the above dispositions may well have been in the first instance, it is reasonable to infer that they were meant to leave the door open for offensive action at a later date, as soon as the first French assistance had made itself felt. For the rest, the Polish General Staff did not possess its own tradition of generalship shaped by long experience. On the one hand, the Polish temperament was more disposed towards attack than defence. It is fair to assume that the mind of the Polish soldier was still coloured, at least subconsciously, by romantic notions from bygone days. I am reminded here of a portrait I once saw of Marshal Ride Smigli painted against a background of charging Polish cavalry squadrons. On the other hand, the newly founded Polish army was French-taught. In view of the fact that French military thought since 1918 had been based on experience of static warfare, it could hardly have imbued the Poles with a sense of operational speed and mobility. It is conceivable, then, that except for a desire not to abandon anything to the enemy, the Polish deployment plan had no clear-cut operational objective whatever, and amounted merely to a compromise between the aggressive ambitions of yesteryear and the necessity of preparing for defence against a superior opponent. At the same time, the Poles made the mistake of assuming that the Germans would carry out an offensive on the French pattern, and that this would soon degenerate into positional warfare. Of some interest in this connection is a confidential report which we received just before the outbreak of war on the subject of Poland's allegedly offensive intentions. It emanated from a source, hitherto regarded as completely reliable, in the immediate circle of either the Polish president or Marshal Rydz-Śmigły, and contended that the Polish deployment would be offensive in character and include the concentration of strong forces in the province of Poznan. Most remarkable of all was the allegation that this plan of campaign had actually been proposed, if not demanded, by the British. In the circumstances, we found the whole thing rather improbable. Yet it was to emerge later that the Poles actually did assemble relatively strong forces in Poznan province, notwithstanding the fact that from their own point of view, this was the least likely direction from which to expect a German attack. The Poznan army was to meet its fate in the battle on the River Bzura. What was more, this line was only about 375 miles long, in contrast to the 1,125-mile arc described by the Polish frontier from Suwałki to the Carpathian passes. Acceptance of this suggestion would, of course, have necessitated abandoning the whole of western Poland, which embraced the country's most precious industrial and agricultural areas, and it is hardly likely that any Polish government would have survived such a step. What also had to be borne in mind was the fact that a withdrawal as extensive as this at the very start of hostilities was hardly likely to increase French aggressiveness in the west, and it was an open question whether surrendering the whole of western Poland to the Germans would not encourage the Russians, for their part, to take immediate steps to secure their share of the spoils in the east. Consequently, Colonel Schneider tells us, another solution was put forward by General Kutrzeba, director of the Polish Military Academy, in a memorandum he submitted to Marshal Rydz-Śmigły at the beginning of 1938. He insisted that there could be no question of giving up Poland's vital strategic zone, which embraced both the industrial regions of Lodz and Upper Silesia and the valuable agricultural areas of Poznan, Kutno and Kielce. Accordingly, he proposed a deployment plan which, while dropping any attempt to hold the corridor or Poznan province, substantially resembled the one ultimately implemented in 1939. To buttress the Polish defences, a far-reaching system of fortifications was to be built south of the East Prussian frontier, in a wide arc from Grudziądz to Poznan, and along the Silesian frontier from Ostrowo, through Częstochowa to Cieszyn. At the same time, General Kutrzeba pointed out, attention should be paid to preparing sally ports for later attacks against both East and West Prussia and Silesia. That to build such far-flung fortifications in adequate strength would have exceeded Polish potentialities was only too clear. Nevertheless, General Kutrzeba had recognized Poland's military inferiority vis-à-vis the Reich. His appraisal of French support was equally clear-sighted, since he took it for granted that even if France rendered the maximum military assistance, Poland would be thrown on her own resources for the first 6 or 8 weeks. He, therefore, envisaged a strategic defence along the western periphery of the above-mentioned vital zone, in the interior of which reserves were to assemble for the decisive operations later on. As I have said, the deployment carried out by the Polish army in 1939 was very similar to that recommended by the general. The latter, however, had envisaged making the main effort in the area Toruń-Bydgoszcz-Gniezno, whereas in 1939 there tended to be 2 focal points, one in the area around East Prussia and the other opposite Silesia. The Polish deployment of 1939, aimed as it was at covering everything, including the forward province of Poznan, was bound to bring defeat, in view of the Germans' superiority and their ability to outflank. How, then, should Poland have operated to avoid such a defeat? The first question to settle was whether the vital strategic zone referred to by General Kutrzeba was to be lost by itself, or, as a result of a German envelopment from East Prussia, Silesia and Slovakia, together with the Polish army. It was the same sort of question as I kept asking Hitler in the years 1943-4, every time he called on me to hold the Donets Basin, the Dnieper, and other areas of Russia. To my mind, the answer to Poland's problem was perfectly clear. As far as her high command was concerned, everything must hinge on the Polish army's ability to hold out at all costs, until an offensive by the Western powers compelled the Germans to withdraw the mass of their forces from the Polish theatre. Then through the loss of the industrial areas would appear, on the face of it, To render Poland incapable of fighting a war of any length, the army's continued existence as a comeback force would still have held out the prospect of winning them back. Whatever happened, the Polish army must not allow itself to be encircled to the west or on both sides of the Vistula. The whole crux of Poland's problem was to play for time. Obviously, no decisive defence could be contemplated anywhere forward of the Bobo-Naro-Vistula line, although it might be possible on the southern flank to move this front up as far as the Dunajec with a view to holding on to the central Polish industrial area between the Vistula and the San. The most important thing of all would have been to eliminate any possibility of encirclement by the Germans from East Prussia and Western Slovakia. A means of doing so in the north was offered by the line of the Bobo-Naro and the Vistula down as far as the fortress of Modlin or Wysegrad. This, at any rate, formed a strong natural obstacle, and additional support was afforded by the former Russian fortifications, obsolete though they were. A further point was that if any German armour at all appeared from East Prussia, it was unlikely to be in great strength. The problem in the south was to obviate an outflanking manoeuvre deep in Poland's rear by defending the Carpathian passes. Both tasks could undoubtedly have been fulfilled with limited forces. To deploy the Polish forces forward of the Bobo-Naro line was just as big a blunder as pushing strong forces out into the corridor and the bulge of Poznan province. Once the necessary guarantees had been created against such deep outflanking in the north and south, it would have been possible to fight a delaying action in the west of Poland, always bearing in mind that the main German thrust was to be expected from Silesia. One reason for this was that the rail and road network in that part of the world allowed a quicker concentration of powerful forces than could be effected in Pomerania, or for that matter, in East Prussia. My only reason for mentioning this is that a gentleman close to Tresco has given currency to a story that I refused to have the latter because he was not a reliable National Socialist. Anyone who knows me will be aware that I did not select my staff on that basis. If those months in Koblenz were to become the winter of our discontent, this arose from the strange suspense of the 1939-40 Shadow War, or Drôle de guerre, as the French called it. It would have been easier to bear had we been able to pin our attentions from the outset on systematically preparing the troops under our command for an offensive in the coming spring. Unfortunately, Hitler was known to want an offensive late that same autumn, and when this proved impossible, at least during the winter. Every time his weather boffins, the Luftwaffe meteorologists, predicted a period of fine weather, he issued the code word, which was the signal for the troops to start moving into their final assembly areas. On each occasion, the meteorologists had to climb down again, either because heavy downpours of rain had made a hopeless mess of the ground, or because a sharp frost and falls of snow had raised doubts as to the advisability of using tanks and aircraft. The result was a process of vacillation between warning orders and countermands, a most frustrating state of affairs for troops and commanders alike. During this period, Hitler's mistrust of military reports, which did not suit his own wishes, revealed itself most strikingly. After Army Group HQ had once again stated that continuous rainfall made it temporarily impossible to form up for the offensive, he sent his military assistant Schmundt to us with orders to examine the state of the ground himself. Trescaf was the ideal man to deal with this. He spent an entire day dragging his erstwhile regimental comrade along well-nigh impassable roads, across sodden ploughland and marshy meadows and up and down slippery hillsides, so that by the time they got back to our headquarters in the evening, Schmundt was in a state of complete exhaustion. From that day on, Hitler dispensed with such wholly improper methods of verifying our weather reports. The person who had most to suffer as a result of this absurd chopping and changing and the consequent wastage of effort was, of course, our Army Group Commander, Colonel General Ver Rundstedt, with whom patience had never been a strong point. Very soon our headquarters was swamped with the flood of paper which regularly descends on fighting units and formation headquarters during the quieter phases of war. thanks to a very proper unwritten law in the German army that the general commanding a formation be kept free of all minor detail. However, V. Rundstedt was hardly affected and was able to take a long walk every morning on the Rhine promenade. Since I, too, had to take some sort of exercise, I often used to meet him. Even in that freezing winter, when the Rhine was already covered with ice, Rundstedt still wore only a thin raincoat. When I protested that he would catch his death of cold, he merely retorted that he had never possessed a greatcoat in his life, and was certainly not going to buy one at his age. And neither did he, for even after all these years the old gentleman still bore the imprint of his Spartan training in the cadet corps. Another habit of Vers Rundstedt's served to remind me of my own days as a cadet. On returning to his desk to await the verbal reports which he daily received from myself and other members of the staff, he would fill in the time by reading a detective thriller. Like many other prominent people, he found a welcome distraction in such literature. But since he was rather shy about this taste of his, he regularly read the novel in an open drawer which could be quickly closed whenever anyone came in to see him. It was the very same thing we had done as cadets whenever an instructor came into our quarters during a private study period. However, our discontent that winter was due in only small measure to Hitler's vacillations and their prejudicial effect on the troops, who were in time liable to doubt the good sense of orders which were repeatedly being cancelled, to say nothing of the fact that the interformation training schedules, which had a particular relevance in the case of the newly formed divisions, were seriously upset. The real cause of our discontent, or, to put it more exactly, our uneasiness, was twofold. In the first place, it arose from a development which I can only describe as the eclipse of OKH. I personally found this development particularly distressing, having fought right up to the winter of 1937-8 as Oberquartiermeister I of the General Staff and assistant to Fritsch and Beck, to ensure that in the event of war OKH would be given its proper position within the framework of overall war policy. Secondly, Army Group HQ sought in vain throughout the winter to get OKH to accept an operations plan which, in our own opinion, at all events, seemed to offer the only guarantee of a decisive victory in the West. This was not adopted as the basis of the offensive until Hitler had finally intervened, and only then after OKH, undoubtedly as the result of our badgering, had removed me from my post as Chief of Staff of the Army Group. These two facts, the demotion of OKH and the struggle over the operations plan, largely form the background to the Western campaign to which this part of the book is devoted. Its later course is already known in such detail that there is no need for me to go through it all again. All I intend to tell of it is what I saw as a corps commander. Nonetheless, the winter of our discontent was still followed by a glorious summer. The elimination of OKH, or the General Staff of the Army, as the authority responsible for war policy on land, is generally assumed to have been effective from the time when Hitler dismissed Field Marshal versus Brauchitsch and took over the leadership of the army, in addition to that of the Wehrmacht as a whole. In actual fact, however, the General Staff was eliminated for all practical purposes, even if this was not yet formally the case, in the weeks immediately following the Polish campaign. After my visit to Zossen on 21st October 1939 to receive Operation Order Yellow on behalf of Army Group A, as Southern Army Group was henceforth to be designated, I noted in my diary, musical accompaniment by Halder, Stülpnagel and Greifenberg extremely depressing. At that time, General Vers Stülpnagel, as Oberquartiermeister I, was the right-hand man of Halder, the chief of the army staff, while Colonel Greifenberg headed the OKH operations branch. It was perfectly evident from the remarks of these three gentlemen that OKH had issued a war plan forced on it by Hitler. They, as well as the commander-in-chief himself, obviously took a thoroughly negative view of the idea of an offensive in the West, and did not consider it the proper way to bring the war to a close. From what they had to say, it could also be gathered that they did not think the German army would be in a position to enforce a decisive denouement in the West. This impression was corroborated both by the operations order, which will be analysed in due course, and by the various visits to be paid to Army Group HQ by the Commander-in-Chief and his Chief of Staff. Now it was quite clear that opinions might differ, particularly during the period of late autumn and winter of 1939, as to the expediency and prospects of a German offensive in the West. What horrified me was my realization of the extent to which OKH's status had declined within the scope of the Supreme Command, and this just after it had conducted one of the most brilliant campaigns in German history. Once before, admittedly, Hitler had disregarded the views of OKH that had been during the Sudeten crisis. But on that occasion, something entirely different had been at stake, not a matter of military leadership, but one of political decision. Hitler's dispute with OKH, primarily with Beck as Chief of the General Staff, had arisen not over the handling of an army operation, but over the question of whether action against Czechoslovakia would lead to intervention by the Western powers, and thereby to a war on two fronts which the German army could not have the capacity to fight. The appraisal of this problem, however, had ultimately been a matter for the political leadership, in whose power it had lain to obviate by political measures any trend towards a war on two fronts. So although the Commander-in-Chief had taken on a grave military responsibility by bowing to the primacy of politics on that occasion, he had still in no way renounced the prerogative of military leadership in his own exclusive sphere. At the time of the Polish crisis, no such divergence of views between Hitler and OKH had reached our ears. Indeed, I am inclined to think that after Hitler's political assessment of the Western powers had proved correct in the case of Czechoslovakia, OKH hoped that the same would apply in autumn 1939. In any case, I believe that throughout those final crucial days of August, OKH assumed right up to the last, just as we did at Southern Army Group, that the whole business would again end in a political settlement similar to that reached at Munich. At all events, if one disregards the wishes he expressed regarding the deployment in East Prussia, to which OKH agreed, Hitler cannot be said to have interfered in the conduct of operations in Poland. Now, however, the position was quite different. It is true, of course, that the question of how the war should be continued after the defeat of Poland was a matter of overall war policy, which ultimately had to be decided by Hitler as the head of state and commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. However, if the solution were to be a land offensive in the West, this must depend entirely on how, when, and whether the army would be able to tackle the task. In these three respects, the primacy of the army leadership was inalienable. Yet in all three, Hitler confronted the high command of the army with a fait accompli when on 27th of September, without prior consultation of the commander-in-chief of the army, he informed the commanders-in-chief of all three services of his decision to take the offensive in the West that same autumn, and, in so doing, to violate the neutrality of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. The decision presently found expression in an OKW directive of 9th of October 1939. I was bound to infer from the remarks made by the three above-named officers when I took over Operation Order Yellow that OKH had resigned itself to this capitis diminutio. It had issued a directive for an offensive of which it steadfastly disapproved, and in whose success, in the decisive sense at least, it had no confidence. In view of the relative strengths on the Western Front, one had to admit that such doubts were not unjustified. I could only deduce, therefore, that OKH had in this case renounced any claim to be the authority responsible for land warfare, and had resigned itself to acting as a purely technical executive organ. The very thing had now come to pass which Colonel General Beck and I had once sought to prevent by our recommendations for a rational distribution of responsibility at the summit in time of war. What we had called for was one single authority which would alone be responsible for advising the head of state on questions of military policy and have joint control of army operations and the overall conduct of the war. For at least as long as it took to decide the issue on the continent, either the commander-in-chief of the army was to have command of the Wehrmacht as a whole, or a Reich Chief of Staff responsible for running the Wehrmacht should simultaneously make the decisions on army policy. What had to be avoided at all costs was that two different general staffs, those of the Wehrmacht and the army, should have a say in the running of the latter. This was precisely what now appeared to have happened. Hitler and his OKW not only decided what operations the army should conduct, but also when and how they should be conducted. OKH was left to work out the appropriate orders, whether or not it agreed with what it was being called on to implement. The Commander-in-Chief of the army had been demoted from the status of military advisor to the head of state to that of a subordinate commander pledged to unquestioning obedience. Before very long, this was to be made only too plain by the creation of an OKW theatre of operations in Norway. The explanation of how OKH came to be brushed aside like this is to be found both on the personal plane and in the manner in which the question of continuing the war after Poland's defeat was handled. The main reason for the trend discussed above lay in the personality of Hitler, in his insatiable thirst for power and his excessive self-esteem, which was engendered by his undeniable successes and encouraged by the lick-spittling of his party bosses and certain members of his retinue. Vis-à-vis his military opponents, he was greatly aided by the fact of being not only the head of state, but also, as Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht, their military superior. Moreover, he had a genius for suddenly confronting his military collaborators with political and economic arguments which they could not immediately refute, and of whose value, in any case, the statesman must perforce be considered the better judge. In the last analysis, however, it was Hitler's lust for power which caused him to usurp the role of the supreme war leader in addition to being the head of state and political chief. A conversation I had with him in 1943 proved most revealing in this respect. It was one of the many times I tried to induce Hitler to accept a rationalized form of command, in other words, to resign the direction of military operations in favor of a fully responsible chief of the General Staff. On the occasion in question, Hitler hotly denied having any desire to play the warlord, though he was undoubtedly attracted by the glory that went with it. On the contrary, he contended, the really decisive thing was that he should have the power and exclusive authority to impose his will. Power was all he believed in, and he regarded his will as the embodiment of that power. Apart from this, it is not unreasonable to suppose that after the Polish campaign, Hitler feared the achievements of the generals might impair his own prestige in the eyes of the people, and that was why he treated OKH so dictatorially from the outset regarding the conduct of the campaign in the West. Such was the man, utterly unscrupulous, highly intelligent and possessed of an indomitable will, with whom generals versus Brauchitsch and Halder had to contend. Not only was he acknowledged by the people as the head of state, he also ranked as the most senior member of the general's own hierarchy. Indeed, it would have been an unequal battle even if Hitler's military opponents had been different men. The future Field Marshal versus Brauchitsch was a very able officer. While not belonging to quite the same class as Baron versus Fritsch, Beck versus Rundstedt versus Bock and Ritter versus Lieb, he certainly ranked immediately after them and, as events have shown, also possessed all the requisite qualities of a commander-in-chief of the army. As far as Weser Brauchitsch's character is concerned, his standards of personal behaviour were quite unassailable. Neither would I dispute his willpower, even though it tended in my own experience to be manifested in a somewhat negative inflexibility rather than in creative resolve. He preferred to have decisions suggested to him rather than to take and impose them on his own initiative. Indeed, he frequently evaded decision in the hope of being spared a struggle to which he did not feel equal. In many cases, Brauchitsch put up a sturdy fight for the interests of the army. One example being his efforts to have Colonel General versus Fritsch publicly rehabilitated by Hitler, although he was well aware how unpopular this would make him with the latter. The order of the day he published on the death of Fritsch was a sign of his courage. At bottom, however, he was no fighter. He was never really the sort of man to get his way by sheer force of personality. Colonel General Beck, for one, complained most bitterly to me about the half-hearted way in which Brauchitsch had represented OKH's point of view at the time of the Czech crisis, and left him, Beck, completely in the lurch. When, on the other hand, people like Herr Wehr Hassel, the former ambassador in Rome, blame Verser Brauchitsch for wavering over the question of whether to resort to violence against Hitler, they forget the essential difference between plotting from behind a desk when one is no longer in a position of responsibility, as was the case with Herr Wehr Hassel, and committing oneself, as leader of the army, to a coup d'état which can imply civil war in peacetime, and lead to the victory of one's external enemies in time of war. Field Marshal Verser Brauchitsch, a man of elegant appearance who bore all the hallmarks of the aristocrat, was never anything but dignified in his bearing. He was correct, courteous, and even charming, although this charm did not always leave one with an impression of inner warmth. Just as he lacked the aggressiveness that commands an opponent's respect, or at least compels him to go warily, so did he fail to impress one as a forceful, productive personality. The general effect was one of coolness and reserve. He often appeared slightly inhibited. He was certainly rather sensitive. Qualities like these might well ensure the support of his immediate collaborators, who respected the gentleman in him, but they were not enough to assure him of the full confidence of the troops which a man like Baron versus Fritsch had enjoyed, nor could they impress a man of Hitler's type. Admittedly, General versus Siecht had been far colder, even to the extent of being unapproachable, but in this case everyone had sensed the inner fire that inspired him and the iron will which made him a leader of men. Neither quality had fallen to the share of von Brauchitsch, nor had he been blessed with that soldierly boldness which, apart from his great qualities as a commander, had won von Fritsch the hearts of his troops. As far as von Brauchitsch's relations with Hitler are concerned, I am convinced that he wore himself out mentally in his struggle with a man of such ruthless will. Disposition, origin, and upbringing precluded him, in his encounters with Hitler, from resorting to the weapons which the latter, relying on his position as the head of state, had not the least hesitation in using. Brauchitsch choked down his vexation and anger, particularly as he was no match for Hitler dialectically. And so it went on until a heart complaint finally compelled him to retire at a time most convenient to Hitler. It is only fair to add that from the very start Brauchitsch found himself in a much more unfavourable position vis-à-vis Hitler than his predecessor had done. To begin with, ever since Blomberg had relinquished his post as Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht, Hitler had not only been head of state, but also the supreme military authority. The final blow dealt to the army by War Minister von Blomberg had been to suggest to Hitler that he should assume command of the Wehrmacht, though, of course, it is open to debate whether Hitler would not have arrived at this solution anyway, with or without Blomberg's advice. Most of all, by the time von Brauchitsch took office, Hitler had acquired a very different attitude towards the army, and in particular towards OKH, from the one he had had in former years. There is no doubt that when he originally came to power, he had shown the military leaders a certain deference and respected their professional abilities. It was an attitude he retained until the last in the case of a man like Field Marshal von Rundstedt, despite having twice relieved him of his command during the war. There were 2 points in particular which led Hitler to change his view of the army in the last years of peace. The first was the realization that under Colonel-General Baron von Fritsch, as indeed under von Brauchitsch, the army stuck firmly to its traditional notions of simplicity and chivalry, and its soldierly conception of honour. While Hitler could certainly not reproach the army with disloyalty towards the state, it was quite obviously not going to throw its military principles overboard in favour of the National Socialist ideology. It was equally clear, moreover, that this was the very thing about the army that made it all the more popular with wide circles of the people. Although Hitler had originally refused to listen to the calumnies against senior military figures served up to him from various party sources, the rabble-rousing campaign against the army, which was mainly the work of people like Göring, Himmler and Goebbels, ultimately bore fruit. Even War Minister von Blomberg helped to arouse Hitler's mistrust, however unintentionally, by going out of his way to stress his task of marrying up the army with National Socialism. The result of this agitation became evident when Göring, ostensibly as the senior officer of the Wehrmacht, addressed a group of high-ranking military leaders in spring 1939. In the course of his speech, he quite brazenly upbraided the army, as distinct from the other two services, for maintaining an outlook that was steeped in tradition and did not fit in with the National Socialist system. It was a speech which Colonel General von Brauchitsch, who was among those present, should on no account have tolerated. The second source of tension in Hitler's relationship with OKH consisted in what he later used to describe, to quote the least insulting of his epithets, as the everlasting hesitation of the generals. The implication here was twofold. One thing he meant was OKH's very proper attempts to check the inordinate pace of rearmament, the steady acceleration of which was detrimental to the quality of the troops. Secondly, Hitler maintained that all his successes in the field of foreign policy had been achieved against the opposition of the generals, who had in each case been too cautious to act. The answer to this is that Colonel General von Fritsch, i.e. OKH, did not raise any objections to Hitler's plans regarding either the introduction of conscription or the occupation of the Rhineland. Neither did General Beck object, von Brauchitsch being absent from Berlin at the time, when Hitler decided to invade Austria. It was the War Minister, von Blomberg, who first opposed general conscription, doing so for reasons of foreign policy which he presently discarded. It was also Blomberg who at the time of the march into the Rhineland advised Hitler, unbeknown to OKH, to recall the German garrisons from the left bank of the river when the French ordered a partial mobilization. The fact that Hitler very nearly followed this advice, only being dissuaded from doing so by Foreign Minister von Neurath's remark that this was not the time to lose one's nerve, may well have served, as a constant reminder of his own fit of weakness, to intensify Hitler's collective resentment against the generals in future. And when OKH repeatedly pointed out in the years of rearmament that the army was still far from being ready for war, they did no more than their duty in issuing these warnings. Officially, Hitler always agreed with them, yet they may well have increased his dislike of OKH. The first time Hitler's foreign policy encountered formal opposition was at the conference with the foreign minister and 3 service chiefs on 5th November 1937, at which Hitler revealed his intentions towards Czechoslovakia. The fact that he clashed with the foreign minister, V. Neurath, as well as the war minister, V. Blomberg, and the commander-in-chief of the army, Baron V. Fritsch, was certainly one of his reasons for getting rid of these admonishers at the earliest opportunity. It is widely believed today that the acceptance of Colonel General Baron v. Fritsch's dismissal by Germany's generals showed Hitler that he could treat OKH just as he liked from then on. Whether this was the conclusion he drew at the time, I should not care to say. If he did, he was certainly mistaken about the generals' motives. Far from being a sign of weakness, their attitude was due to ignorance of the true facts of the case, their inability as decent soldiers to believe the state leadership capable of such a base intrigue, and the practical impossibility in such circumstances of carrying out a coup d'état. Finally, there can be no doubt that the party personalities I mentioned above were forever harping on the theme of the everlasting objections of the generals in conversations with Hitler. It is quite certain, therefore, that versus Brauchitsch found himself in an extremely difficult position from the start, as far as Hitler was concerned. On assuming office, moreover, he was ill-advised enough to make a number of concessions affecting personnel, including the quite unjustified dismissal of a number of generals with excellent records and the appointment of General Keitel's brother as head of the Heerespersonalamt, i.e. as military secretary, Char. This was Brauchitsch's first fatal step. The devastating blow to OKH's standing vis-à-vis Hitler came at the time of the Sudeten crisis, when, thanks to the tractability of the Western powers, Hitler proved himself right in face of all the army's misgivings and objections. Von Brauchitsch's action in sacrificing his chief of staff on this occasion naturally weakened his position even further in Hitler's eyes. The second OKH personality, who had to deal direct with Hitler after Beck's dismissal, Colonel General Halder, was Field Marshal versus Brauchitsch's equal as regards military qualifications. At all events, The two men worked together on terms of close confidence, and I am inclined to believe that when Verser Brauchitsch agreed with Halder's recommendations, he did so from conviction. Like most of the officers who had begun their careers on the Bavarian General Staff, Halder had a remarkable grasp of every aspect of staff duties and was a tireless worker into the bargain. A saying of Moltke's, "Genius is diligence," might well have been his motto. Yet this man hardly glowed with the sacred fire that is said to inspire really great soldiers. While it speaks for his high sense of responsibility that he prepared for the Russian campaign by having an operations plan drawn up by the Oberquartiermeister Thur, General Paulus, on the basis of studies made by the chiefs of staff of the army groups, the fact remains that the basic concept of a campaign plan should be born in the mind of the man who has to direct that campaign. In his outward bearing, Halder had not the elegance of Verser Brauchitsch. He was incorruptibly objective in his utterances, and I myself have known him put a criticism to Hitler with the utmost frankness. On the same occasion, one also saw how fervently he stood up for the interests of the fighting troops, and how much he felt for them when wrong decisions were imposed on him. Unfortunately, objectivity and moderation alone were not the qualities which could impress Hitler, and any feeling of sympathy for the troops left him completely cold. What ultimately led to Halder's downfall, in my own opinion, was his divided allegiance. Even when he took over from Beck, he was already a declared enemy of Hitler. According to Walter Görlitz, in his book The German General Staff, Halder told Verser Brauchitsch on taking office that his only reason for accepting the post was to fight against Hitler. He is credited with numerous plans for Hitler's overthrow, though it is hard to say what real prospects of success these would have had in practice. On the other hand, Halder was Germany's and later Hitler's chief of staff, after the latter had taken over command of the army. Now, although it may be given to a politician to play the dual role of responsible advisor and conspirator, soldiers are not usually fitted for this kind of thing. Above all, it is traditionally unthinkable in Germany that a chief of the general staff should not be on terms of confidence with his commander-in-chief. Even if, in the light of Hitler's actions, it is accepted as admissible for a chief of staff to plan the overthrow of the head of state and commander-in-chief in peacetime, the dual role of chief of staff and plotter in wartime inevitably created an insoluble dilemma. As chief of the general staff, it was Halder's duty to strive for the victory of the army he was jointly responsible for leading. In other words, to see that the military operations of his commander-in-chief were successful. In the second of his roles, however, he could not desire such a victory. There cannot be the least doubt that Halder, when confronted by this difficult choice, opted for his military duty and did everything in his power to serve the German army in its arduous struggle. At the same time, his other role demanded that he should at all costs hold on to the position which he hoped would one day enable him to bring about Hitler's removal. To that end, however, he had to bow to the latter's military decisions, even if he did not agree with them. Certainly his chief reason for remaining was that he thought this his best hope of protecting the army from the consequences of Hitler's military blunders. But in doing so, he had to pay the price of executing orders to which his military convictions prevented him from agreeing. The conflict was bound to wear him down inwardly and finally lead to his downfall. One thing is certain: it was in the interest of what was at stake, and not of his own person, that Colonel General Halder stuck it out for so long as Chief of Staff. I have endeavoured to give a pen portrait of the two personalities under whom, in autumn 1939, there culminated a process which can only be described as the eclipse of OKH. From what I have said, it will be clear why neither of these officers, first-rate though they undoubtedly were, could be a match for a man like Hitler. At the same time, the fact that OKH's relegation to a purely executive organ was actually accomplished just after it had scored such brilliant victories in Poland was also due to the way in which Hitler and OKH respectively approached the problem of how the war should henceforth be prosecuted. Up till and immediately after the outbreak of war, Germany had quite naturally prepared only for defence in the West. Who could have guessed that the Western powers would let Poland down so ignominiously after giving her a guarantee? Their feeble push into the forward zone of the Siegfried Line along the Saar, which was immediately followed by a withdrawal onto French territory, could not be regarded as even the preparatory step for any large offensive later on. As long as such an offensive had been definitely expected, it had only been possible to wait and see whether we should succeed in halting it at the Siegfried Line or, in the event of its being launched towards the Ruhr through Luxembourg and Belgium, in delivering a counterblow once the necessary forces had been released from Poland. Now, however, an entirely new situation had been created by the inaction of the Western powers. Even when allowance was made for French methods and the time the British took to act, the Western powers could not be expected to take the offensive in the immediate future, now that Poland was beaten and the whole of the German army available for the West. Poland's fate was sealed at the latest by 18th of September, when the Battle of the Bzura was over and the Soviets had crossed her eastern frontier the previous day. This, then, should have been the deadline for an exchange of views between Hitler and the commander-in-chief of the army on what action to take in the West. Yet, judging by the books published to date, notably those of General Verslosberg, at that time the senior operations officer at OKW, and ministerial rat Greiner, the OKW war diarist, no such discussions took place. It may be assumed that the reactions of Hitler and the OKH leaders to the brilliant success in Poland and the unexpected inaction of the Western powers were entirely different. Hitler undoubtedly interpreted the failure of the Anglo-French forces to take the offensive as a sign of weakness which would permit him to attack in the West himself. Furthermore, what had happened in Poland convinced him that henceforth there could be no task too big for the German army to tackle. OKH, as will be seen, did not share this view by any means. On the other hand, it was permissible to infer from the attitude of the Western powers that they had only entered the war to save their faces, and that it must thus be possible to come to terms with them. Also, General Halder may have toyed with the idea of paving the way to such an understanding by removing Hitler, so that any German offensive in the West at that particular juncture would have been quite out of place. Whatever the answer, OKH could be certain that until then Hitler had never contemplated, even after the fall of Poland, the idea of an offensive in the West. I was given infallible proof of this in the winter of 1939–40. On one of the many occasions when Hitler issued the preparatory code word to put the final troop movements into the assembly areas in train, I was visited by the Chief of Staff of the Air Fleet supporting Army Group A, General Sperler, who told me that his formations would be unable to take off from the waterlogged airfields. When I objected that the Luftwaffe had had months in which to construct solid runways, Sperler assured me that Hitler had on an earlier occasion strictly forbidden any kind of work associated with a future offensive. In the same connection, it may be noted that the ammunition production had not attained the level necessary for an eventual offensive in the West. Obviously, OKH had misjudged Hitler's mentality in assuming that his viewpoint was immutable. Greiner tells us that during the second half of September, when the end was approaching in Poland, OKH had had a paper on the further conduct of the war in the West prepared by General Heinrich versus Stülpnagel. The conclusion he reached was that the German army would not be adequately equipped to break through the Maginot Line before 1942. He had not considered the possibility of going around through Belgium and Holland, because the Reich government had only recently assured these countries that their neutrality would be respected. In the light of this paper and Hitler's attitude hitherto, OKH had evidently deduced that the policy in the West would continue to be defensive. At the end of the Polish campaign, it accordingly ordered the army's defensive deployment in the West to be reinforced, manifestly without first obtaining Hitler's approval. In the completely new situation created by the total collapse of Poland, such a policy was tantamount to resigning the initiative to Hitler regarding any future plans. It was certainly not the right way for the military leaders to safeguard their influence on the further course of the war, whatever form this might take. Apart from that, the conclusions reached by via Stülpenagel could not be regarded as an answer to the problem of Germany's future war policy. If we were to wait until 1942 to penetrate the Maginot Line, the Western powers would in all likelihood have caught up with our lead in arms production. In addition, it would never have been possible to develop a decisive operation from a successful penetration of the Maginot Line. Against the minimum of 100 divisions available on the enemy side since 1939, this was no way to achieve decisive results. Even if the enemy committed powerful forces for the actual defence of the Maginot Line, he would still have been left with an adequate strategic reserve of between 40 and 60 divisions, with which immediately to intercept even a wide breakthrough of the fortifications. Without any doubt, the struggle would have petered out inconclusively into trench warfare. Such could not be the aim of German strategy. One cannot assume, of course, that Colonel-General Verser Brauchitsch and his Chief of Staff thought they would achieve anything with a purely defensive strategy in the long run. Nonetheless, they did pin their hopes initially on the possibility that the Western powers would either still come to terms or take the offensive themselves in the end. Unfortunately, they were not competent to take decisions in the former contingency, and their hope for an Allied offensive was, as will be shown, unrealistic. The fact of the matter was that from a military point of view, the spring of 1940 was not only the earliest but also the latest occasion on which Germany could have hoped to fight a successful offensive in the West. According to Greiner, Hitler was not informed of the Stülpenagel memorandum, but must still have been aware that OKH was going to cling to a defensive policy in the West. Instead of the timely discussion on the future course of the war that should have taken place at the latest by mid-September, he now confronted the Commander-in-Chief of the Army with the fait accompli of his decision of 27th September and the OKW directive which followed on 9th October. Without any previous consultation with the Commander-in-Chief, he not only ordered offensive measures in the West, but even decided on the timing and method to be adopted. All of these were matters that should on no account have been settled without the concurrence of the Commander-in-Chief. Hitler required the offensive to be launched at the earliest possible date, in any event before the autumn was out. Originally, according to General versus Lossberg, he fixed 15th of October as the deadline. At the latest, this would have meant disengaging the armour and aircraft in Poland at the end of the Battle of the Bzura. Furthermore, Hitler had laid down how the proposed offensive operation should be conducted, namely by bypassing the Maginot Line via Belgium and Holland. The Commander-in-Chief of the Army was to be left with merely the technical execution of an operation on which he had deliberately not been consulted, and for which, in autumn 1939 at all events, he could certainly not guarantee any prospect of decisive success. For those who wonder how the Commander-in-Chief of the Army could possibly accept such a capitis diminutio of his position by acceding to Hitler's intentions, Greiner has probably given the right answer in his book Die Oberste Wehrmachtführung. He suggests that Versus Brauchitsch, feeling that he was unlikely to achieve anything by immediate opposition, hoped that if he put up a show of goodwill at the beginning, he would ultimately be able to talk Hitler out of his plan. Incidentally, the same view is advanced by General Verser Lossberg on the strength of his own knowledge of Hitler and the latter's attitude at the time. Brauchitsch may also have been counting on the weather to make it impossible to carry out a late autumn or winter offensive when the day came. If the decision could thus be delayed until the following spring, ways and means might be found of ending the war by a political compromise. If these really were the thoughts of the Commander-in-Chief and his Chief of Staff, they certainly proved right as far as the weather went. But the notion that Hitler could be talked out of such a fundamental decision, even by General Verser Reichenau, to whom OKH duly entrusted the task of doing this, was to my mind quite futile. The only hope would have been if OKH had been able to offer a better solution of its own which would impress Hitler. As for there being any possibility of ending the war at that time by peaceful negotiation, none emerged. The peace offer made by Hitler to the Western powers after the Polish campaign met with a flat rejection. Besides, Hitler would most probably not have accepted any reasonable settlement of the Polish question that would have made it possible to reach an understanding with the West. In any case, such a settlement was hardly conceivable now that Soviet Russia had swallowed the eastern half of Poland. Another very doubtful point is how Germany could have achieved an honourable peace without Hitler at that time. How was he to be overthrown? If General Halder had any fresh plan to take military action against Berlin in October 1939, all I can say is that he would have found even less support among the troops than in autumn 1938. To begin with, then, Colonel General versus Brauchitsch fell in with Hitler's intentions, and OKH drafted Operation Order Yellow, in accordance with the policy Hitler had laid down. By 27th October, however, the Commander-in-Chief, backed by his Chief of Staff, was trying to persuade Hitler on military grounds to postpone the offensive till a more favourable time of year, by which he presumably meant spring 1940. According to Greiner, the same recommendation had been made to Hitler a few days previously by General Verser Reichenau, probably at versus Brauchitsch's request. Though Hitler did not entirely reject the arguments put up to him, the date he had fixed as long ago as 22nd October for the start of the offensive 12th November continued to hold good. On 5th November, first Brauchitsch made a fresh attempt to bring Hitler round. This was the day, assuming that the attack really did start on 12th November, on which the code word had to be issued for the troops to begin moving into the assembly areas. Though this conversation took place in private, Keitel was not called in until later author. Details of it leaked out, and its upshot was what I believe to have been an irreparable breach between Hitler and the generals. According to what Greiner gathered from Keitel, versus Brauchitsch read Hitler a memorandum comprising all his reasons for objecting to an offensive that autumn. Besides citing such incontrovertible facts as the state of the weather and the unpreparedness of the new formations, he advanced one argument which lashed Hitler into a white fury. It was a criticism of the performance of the fighting troops in the Polish campaign. Brauchitsch advanced the view that the infantry had not displayed the same aggressive spirit as in 1914, and that the discipline and staying power of combat units had not always been entirely up to standard as a result of the tempo of rearmament. Had Verser Brauchitsch been talking to an audience of senior commanders, they would have seen his point. Admittedly, he was not justified in his charge that the infantry had not shown the same aggressiveness as in 1914, at least as long as he expressed it in those generalized terms. This was due to a misunderstanding of the transformation through which the infantry attack had passed in the years between. The 1914 methods of attack were just not conceivable any longer. On the other hand, it could not be denied, and this occurs with untried troops at the beginning of every war, that individual units had occasionally shown signs of jitters, particularly when fighting in built-up areas. Furthermore, various higher formation headquarters had found it necessary to crack down on cases of indiscipline. These facts were not surprising if one considered that in the space of a very few years, the Reichswehr of 100,000 men had been inflated to an army several millions strong, a large proportion of whom had only been with the colours since the general mobilization. But none of this, in the light of the victories in Poland, could be adequate reason for concluding that the army was unable to fight an offensive in the West. If only Colonel General Verser Brauchitsch had confined himself to emphasizing that the newly formed divisions were still precluded by their lack of training and inner stability from going into action, and that the offensive could not be carried out with the experienced divisions alone, he would have been on just as safe ground as he was with his objections to the season of the year. A generalization of the kind mentioned above, however, was the very last argument he should have advanced in any conversation with Hitler, who saw himself as the creator of that new Wehrmacht, whose fighting qualities were now being called into question. Indeed, Hitler was right to the extent that if it had not been for his political audacity in pushing ahead with rearmament, and for the part played by National Socialism in reviving the military spirit even among those social strata where it had been ostracized during the Weimar Republic, this Wehrmacht would never have attained the strength it possessed in 1939. What Hitler chose to overlook was that the achievements of the former Reichswehr were entirely on a par with his own. For had not the officers and non-commissioned officers who stemmed from the old Reichswehr devoted themselves so wholeheartedly to the preliminary planning and material preparations, Hitler would neither have come by the Wehrmacht he now regarded as his creation, nor could the victories in Poland have been won. By raising such objections in the presence of Hitler, a dictator whose self-esteem was already inflated, Versprauchitsch attained precisely the opposite of what he intended. Disregarding all Versprauchitsch's factual arguments, Hitler took umbrage at the criticism he had presumed to direct against his, Hitler's own, achievements, and brusquely broke off the interview. He insisted on adhering to 12th November as the operative date. Fortunately, the weather god took a hand at this juncture and enforced a postponement, a process that was to repeat itself 15 times before the end of January. Therefore, even though OKH had ultimately proved its point vis-à-vis Hitler regarding the possible date of the offensive, the upshot was a crisis of leadership whose consequences were to become appallingly obvious in the further course of the war. Its immediate effect was that Hitler and Brauchitsch ceased to meet. The GSO Quai of the operations branch, the future General Heusinger, told me on 18th of January 1940 that Brauchitsch had not seen Hitler since 5th November, a quite impossible situation with things as they were. A further consequence of the breach of 5th November was the talk given by Hitler to the commanders and chiefs of staff of all army groups, armies and corps in the Reich Chancellery on 23rd November. I need not go into this fully, as it has already become known through other publications. Its essential points were Hitler's emphasis on his irrevocable decision to take the offensive in the West at the earliest possible date, and the doubts which he even then expressed as to how long the Reich would remain free from an attack in the rear in the East. As far as his factual explanation of the fundamental need to take the offensive in the West went, his remarks were well considered and, I thought, convincing, except for the question of timing. Otherwise, his speech constituted a massive attack not only on OKH, but on the generals of the army as a whole, whom he accused of constantly obstructing his boldness and enterprise. In this respect, it was the most biased speech I ever heard Hitler make. The commander-in-chief of the army did the only possible thing and tendered his resignation. This Hitler refused to accept, though that was obviously no solution to the crisis. OKH was still in the unhappy position of having to prepare for an offensive of which it did not approve. The commander-in-chief was still repudiated as an advisor on overall war policy and relegated to the status of a purely executive general. Any inquiry into the reasons for such a development in the relationship between the head of state and the army leaders will show the decisive factor to have been Hitler's thirst for power and his ever-growing self-conceit, both of which were augmented by the mischief-making of the Goerings and Himmlers. Yet it must also be stated that OKH made no small contribution towards its own elimination at Hitler's hands, by the way it handled the problem of how the war should be prosecuted after the Polish campaign. By deciding to remain on the defensive in the West, OKH resigned the initiative to Hitler, although it should unquestionably have been OKH's business in the first instance to recommend to the head of state what steps were to be taken after the army, effectively supported by the Luftwaffe, had defeated Poland so swiftly. OKH was undoubtedly right to take the view in autumn 1939 that the time of year and the immaturity of the new formations made an offensive inadvisable at that stage. But neither this simple statement of fact nor the arrangements made to reinforce the defensive dispositions in the West provided an adequate answer to the problem of how to bring the war to a satisfactory conclusion in the military sense. This question had to be answered by OKH if it were to assert its influence on overall strategy. The commander-in-chief of the army certainly had every right to recommend the course of political settlement with the Western powers. But what was to happen if no prospect of such a settlement emerged? With a man of Hitler's type it was particularly necessary, even if an offensive in the West did not seem expedient at that moment, that OKH should indicate there and then the military way to end the war. Consequently, there were three questions to consider once the Polish campaign was over. First, could the war be brought to a favourable conclusion by sticking to defensive tactics, or could this object be achieved only by a victorious German offensive in the West? Secondly, if such an offensive proved necessary, when could it be launched with any prospect of decisive success? Thirdly, how must it be conducted to ensure an effective victory on the continent? As far as the first question went, there were two possibilities. One was that the Reich would reach a settlement with the Western powers after the fall of Poland. OKH was bound to regard this sceptically from the outset, partly because of the British national character, which made it fairly improbable that Great Britain would come to terms, and partly because Hitler was unlikely, once Poland had been defeated, to be prepared for a reasonable settlement of the German-Polish frontier question in the sense of a compromise. After all, in order to reach agreement with the Western powers, he had to re-establish Poland, and this he could not do after having made over her eastern part to the Soviets. That much was an accomplished fact, which not even another German government attaining power after Hitler's overthrow could have removed. The other possibility of successfully ending the war by remaining on the defensive might occur if the Western powers should decide, after all, to take the offensive. This would offer the Germans the prospect of attaining a victorious decision in the West in the course of delivering a counterblow. The same idea emerges in the book Gespräche mit Halder, where Halder is quoted as speaking of an operation on the rebound. According to General Husinger, however, OKH only began to consider the project much later, i.e. sometime in December, and not at the turn of September and October, the phase so vital for its own position. Undoubtedly there was something very attractive about fighting an operation on the rebound, for the idea of saddling the enemy with the burden of an offensive against the Siegfried Line, or the odium of violating the neutrality of Luxembourg, Belgium, and perhaps even Holland, was inevitably an extremely tempting one. But was this not really a case of wishful thinking, at least for the foreseeable future? Could it be supposed that the Western powers, who had not dared to launch an offensive while the mass of the German forces were tied down in Poland, would attack now that the Wehrmacht faced them in full strength? I do not believe, and neither did I at the time, that any basis existed for a German rebound operation. This view has found clear corroboration in a war plan drafted at the time on the orders of the Allied Commander-in-Chief, General Gamelin. The main train of thought reflected in this document, which later fell into the hands of German troops, was as follows. Before spring 1941, the Allied forces would not have amassed the material strength to take the offensive against Germany in the West. To attain a numerical superiority of ground forces, fresh allies would have to be won. The British were not prepared to participate in a large offensive before 1941, except in the event of a partial collapse of Germany. This remark, which obviously implies a hope of revolution, shows what we should have had to expect from a coup d'etat. The principal task of the Western powers in 1940 had to be to safeguard the integrity of French territory and, of course, to hasten to the assistance of Belgium and Holland if they were attacked. In addition, every effort would be made to create further theatres of attrition for Germany. Those named were the Nordic states and, if Italy remained neutral, the Balkans. Naturally, the attempts to bring in Belgium and Holland on the side of the Allies would continue. Finally, endeavours would be made to deprive the Reich of its vital imports, both by the already mentioned creation of new theatres of war and by tightening the blockade through pressure on the neutral powers. From this war plan, it becomes palpably clear that the Western powers intended to wage a war of attrition in as many different theatres as possible, until such time as they had attained the clear preponderance which would allow them, though in no case before 1941, to launch an offensive in the West. Although OKH could not at the time in question know of this Allied war plan, it was only too likely that the Western powers would fight a long-term war in the sense indicated. In view of the bloody prospects an assault on the Siegfried Line would entail, the hope that the French and British peoples would tire of the phony war was hardly a realistic basis for any OKH decisions. In no event could Germany wait until the enemy had built up his armaments, and in the light of Roosevelt's attitude, allowance must be made here for American aid, to a point where he was stronger on land and in the air as well as at sea. Least of all could she afford to do so with the Soviet Union at her back. The latter, having by this time obtained all it could hope for from Hitler, had hardly any more vital interests in common with the Reich, and the stronger the Western powers grew, the more precarious the position of Germany would become. As far as the military leaders were concerned, therefore, the situation after the Polish campaign was this. The answer to the first of the above three questions, i.e., whether the war could be brought to a successful conclusion by remaining on the defensive in the West, must be in the negative unless the political leadership could still manage to reach a compromise with the Western powers. The right of the commander-in-chief of the army to advise Hitler to resort to compromise is beyond all doubt, if only because of the military risk a prolongation of the war would entail. Such action would, of course, involve accepting a temporary delay on the Western Front. Irrespective of that, however, it was both the duty and the right of the army leaders to give Hitler military guidance. They had to tell him what military steps were to be taken if no political solution of the conflict could be reached. In other words, it was up to OKH to present Hitler with an alternative military plan if it proved impossible to achieve the political compromise with the Western powers, for which even Hitler evidently hoped in the first instance. One must not assume that Hitler would continue as hitherto to reject an offensive in the West once Poland was beaten, nor must one wait until he took a military decision on his own account. No military recommendation on the prosecution of the war could consist in maintaining the defensive in the West, unless it were thought that Britain could be brought to her knees by aerial and submarine warfare, an assumption for which no real foundation existed. On the military side, therefore, assuming that a political understanding proved unattainable, the only recommendation one could make was that the war in the West be conducted offensively. When such a recommendation was submitted, moreover, it was essential that OKH should assure itself of the initiative in deciding on the timing and method. As far as timing went, OKH was in agreement with all the commanders on the Western Front that no decisive success could be gained from launching the offensive in the late autumn or winter. The principal reason for this was the season. In autumn and winter, the Wehrmacht would be prevented by weather conditions from playing its two big trumps, armour and Luftwaffe, to their fullest effect. In addition, the short period of daylight at this time of the year renders it virtually impossible to win even a tactical decision in the space of a single day, thereby cutting down the speed of operations. The other reason was the still inadequate standard of training of all the new formations set up on the outbreak of war. The only troops really fit to go into action in autumn 1939 were the active divisions. None of the others had had enough experience of handling weapons or of operating as integral parts of a larger formation, nor did they as yet possess the requisite degree of inner stability. Furthermore, the refitting of the armoured formations following the Polish campaign was still not complete. If it were intended to start an offensive in the West before the end of autumn 1939, the mechanized divisions in Poland should have been released at an earlier date, but that was a point which had not occurred to Hitler. Over and above all this, serious deficiencies existed in the Luftwaffe. Thus it was clear that an offensive in the West could not be justified before spring 1940. That this afforded time to seek a political solution of the conflict was welcome from the point of view of the military, little as it counted with Hitler after the rejection of his peace offer at the beginning of October. Since the problem of method, namely the strategic preparation of an offensive in the West, is the subject of the next chapter, there is no point in going into it any further here. Only this may be said in advance. The offensive plan imposed by Hitler on 9th of October was a half measure. Instead of being aimed at a complete decision on the continent, it was, initially at any rate, concerned only with an interim objective. This was the point that provided OKH with its opportunity to bring home to Hitler that his military advisers had something better to offer than a partial solution not worthy of the stake involved. Always providing, of course, that OKH itself believed that by launching an offensive it could achieve a complete decision on the continent. It is still not known what prompted the OKH leaders to remain so non-committal on future policy in the West during those vital weeks after the Polish campaign that the military decision was actually placed in Hitler's hands. They may have been moved by a very proper desire to make him seek a political compromise. They may also have rightly shunned a repetition of the violation of Belgian neutrality and all that went with it. At the time, however, an outsider was left with the impression that the OKH leaders considered it doubtful, to say the least, whether any German offensive would be decisively successful. Be that as it may, OKH left the initiative to Hitler to make the military decision. By further bowing to Hitler's will and putting out the orders for an operation with which its leaders privately disagreed, it resigned for all practical purposes as the authority responsible for land warfare. When shortly afterwards the operational proposals put up by HQ Army Group A gave OKH a chance to regain its lost position, it let the opportunity slip through its fingers. By the time the Western offensive, thanks to these same proposals, had achieved a degree of success exceeding even Hitler's original expectations, the latter regarded OKH as a body which he could bypass even in matters of grand tactics. Hitler had taken over the functions which Schlieffen believed could at best be performed in our age by a triumvirate of king, statesman and warlord. Now he had also usurped the role of the warlord, but had the drop of Samuel's anointing oil, which Schlieffen considered indispensable for at least one of the triumvirs, really fallen on his head. Not until after the war did anything become generally known about the background of the plan, which replaced OKH's original Operation Order Yellow of 19th and 29th October 1939, as the basis of our offensive in the West, the plan by which so swift and decisive a victory was scored over the Anglo-French armies and the forces of Belgium and Holland. The first to disclose how this new plan emerged was probably Liddell Hart, who linked my name with it as a result of statements made to him by Field Marshal Vers Rundstedt and General Blumentritt, our Chief of Operations during the period in question. See The Other Side of the Hill, Cassel, 1948. Tuttier. Since I may be considered to have been the prime mover in this matter, it seems right that I should now make my own attempt, on the basis of the records at my disposal, to show how the plan came into being, especially as it has since acquired a certain significance. After all, the ideas behind the plan were mine, just as it was I who drafted all the memoranda to OKH, by which we sought to have the operation planned on the only lines conducive, in our opinion, to decisive success in the West. Finally, it was I who, when already replaced as Chief of Staff of the Army Group, had an opportunity to expound to Hitler in person the ideas that our headquarters had so long failed to get accepted by OKH. Only a few days after this, OKH put out a new operation order based on our recommendations. At the same time, I would stress that my commander, Colonel General Vers Rundstedt, and my collaborators Blumentritt and Treschkow agreed with my view throughout, and that Vers Rundstedt backed our recommendations to the full with his own signature. Without his sanction, we could never have kept up our attempts to change OKH's mind by these repeated memoranda. The war historian or officer reading military history might well find it worth his while to study this intellectual tussle over an operation plan in its entirety. For the purpose of this book, however, I shall confine myself initially to outlining the OKH's plan, and to explaining what I could not help regarding as the shortcomings of its, or more precisely, of Hitler's, strategic conception. Next, by way of contrast to the OKH plan, I propose to deal with the essential arguments on which the Army Group based its strategic considerations. Last of all, I shall briefly show how, after a long series of frustrations, the original operation plan was finally amended, undoubtedly on Hitler's instructions, to coincide with the views of our own headquarters. If asked to define, in the light of the operation orders issued by OKH, the basic strategy which that body and Hitler planned to adopt in the West, I would put it this way. OKH proposed, in accordance with Hitler's directive of 9th of October, to send a strong right wing of the German armies through Holland into northern Belgium to defeat the Anglo-French forces it expected to encounter there, together with the Belgians and Dutch. In other words, the decision was primarily to be sought by a strong thrust on the right wing. This assault wing consisted of Army Detachment N, an army detachment, Armeeabteilung, being a small army of 2 or 3 army corps, and Army Group B, Colonel General V. Bock, and was to assemble in the area of the Lower Rhine and the Northern Eifel. Army Group B had 3 armies under command. Altogether, the northern wing embraced 30 infantry divisions and the bulk of the mobile formations, 9 armoured and 4 infantry divisions. Since the total number of German divisions available on the Western Front was 102, these therefore constituted almost half our aggregate strength. While Army Detachment N's task was the elimination of Holland, the 3 armies in the army group were to attack through northern Belgium, passing north and south of Liège. The strong tank forces were intended to play a decisive role here in an attempt to overrun the enemy. On 29th of October, this first operation order was amended to leave Holland out of the picture in the initial stages. This may have been due to representations from OKH. Henceforth Army Group B was to attack round both sides of Liège with 2 armies up, 4th and 6th, and 2, 18th and 2nd, following through. Later, however, Holland was again included in the operation, her elimination being this time entrusted to 18th Army. The decisive thrust of Army Group B was to be covered on the southern flank by Army Group A. The latter, consisting of 2 armies, 12th and 16th, and a total of 22 divisions, none of them with any mechanized troops, was to advance through southern Belgium and Luxembourg, after assembling in the southern Eifel and the Hunsrück. 12th Army was to follow through on the left of Army Group B, establishing a system of echeloned defence as it went in order to cover the further advance of Army Group B against enemy incursions. 16th Army was to wheel south after crossing Luxembourg in order to protect the deep flank of the whole operation by establishing a defensive position running closely along the north of the Maginot Line's westward projection, between the Saar and the Meuse east of Sedan. Army Group C was left with 2 armies and 18 infantry divisions to hold the Siegfried Line from the Luxembourg frontier down to Switzerland. 17 infantry and 2 mobile divisions were available as army reserves. The aim of this operation was defined in paragraph 1 of the OKH Operation Order of 19th of October under the heading General Intention, in pursuance of Hitler's OKW directive of 9th of October. It was to defeat the largest possible elements of the French and Allied armies, and simultaneously to gain as much territory as possible in Holland, Belgium, and northern France, as a basis for successful air and sea operations against Britain and as a broad protective zone for the Ruhr. Paragraph 2 of the operation order indicated that the first object of the 2 army groups' assault, which was to be coordinated under the Commander-in-Chief of the Army versus Brauchitsch, must be, while eliminating the Dutch armed forces, to defeat as many elements of the Belgian army as possible in the vicinity of the frontier fortifications, and by rapidly concentrating powerful mechanized forces, to create a basis for the immediate prosecution of the attack with a strong right wing and the swift occupation of the Belgian coastline. In the aforementioned amendment to the operation order issued on 29th of October, OKH somewhat extended the aim of Army Group B's operation by rewording the general intention. Henceforth, this was to consist in engaging and destroying the largest possible elements of the French army in northern France and Belgium, thereby creating favourable conditions for the prosecution of the war against Britain and France by land and air. In the paragraph headed Order of Battle and Tasks, OKH set the Army Group the aim of destroying the Allied forces north of the Somme and driving through to the Channel coast. The covering role of Army Group A which continued to be mainly defensive, was broadened to the extent that its right-hand army, 12th, had now to be pushed over the Meuse opposite and south of Fumay, and then to head through France's fortified frontier zone in the general direction of Laon. The operational intention of both operation orders might best be expressed by saying that the Anglo-French elements we expected to meet in Belgium were to be floored by a powerful, straight right, while our weaker left fist covered up. The territorial objective was the Channel coastline. What would follow this first punch we were not told. Significantly enough, my first reaction to the plan laid down in these two operation orders was emotional rather than intellectual. The strategic intentions of OKH struck me as being essentially an imitation of the famous Schlieffen Plan of 1914. I found it humiliating, to say the least, that our generation could do nothing better than repeat an old recipe, even when this was the product of a man like Schlieffen. What could possibly be achieved by turning up a war plan our opponents had already rehearsed with us once before, and against whose repetition they were bound to have taken full precautions? For it was obvious to any military mind that the Germans would be even less keen or able to assault the Maginot Line of 1939 than they had the Verdun-Toul, Nancy-Epinal fortifications of 1914. By this first rather emotional reaction of mine, however, I did OKH an injustice. One reason was that the plan had come from Hitler. Another was that it was actually far from being a repetition of Schlieffen's. The widespread view that this was so is correct in two respects only, i.e. it was intended in 1939, as in 1914, to place the main weight of the German offensive on the northern wing, and both plans also involved marching through Belgium. Otherwise, the plans of 1914 and 1939 were widely divergent. In the first place, the situations were entirely different. In 1914 it had still been possible, as Schlieffen did, to count on strategic surprise. Even if this did not include the march through Belgium, it certainly applied to the massing of Germany's forces on the extreme northern wing. In 1939, the corresponding intention on Hitler's part could not be concealed from the enemy. Furthermore, there was reason in 1914 for hoping, as Schlieffen did, that the French would do us the good turn of launching a premature offensive into Lorraine. In 1939, no such development could be expected. The enemy would immediately throw in strong forces to meet our drive through Belgium and Holland, and these, in contrast to 1914, would have to be tackled mainly head-on. Instead of taking the initiative prematurely in the centre of the front, the French were likely to strike a powerful backhand blow at the southern flank of our main forces during their advance through Belgium. In other words, the Schlieffen Plan just could not be repeated. Apart from this, I soon realized that neither OKH nor Hitler had any intention of copying the Schlieffen Plan in the full magnitude of its conception. Schlieffen had drafted his plan with an eye to the utter and final defeat of the entire French army. His aim was to outflank the enemy straight off in the north with a wide right hook, and then, having cleared the whole of northern France, to drive down to the west of Paris and push the entire enemy army back against a front extending from Metz through the Vosges to the Swiss frontier, compelling it in the end to capitulate. To achieve this, he had accepted the risk of initial reverses in Alsace, at the same time hoping that the enemy, by unleashing an offensive in Lorraine, would do their own bit towards making the Germans' big outflanking operation a complete success. The 1939 operation plan, on the other hand, contained no clear-cut intention of fighting the campaign to a victorious conclusion. Its object was, quite clearly, partial victory, defeat of the Allied forces in northern Belgium, and territorial gains, possession of the Channel coast as a basis for future operations. It may be that when the then Colonel General versus Brauchitsch and his Chief of Staff were drafting the 1939 operation order, they were reminded of what Moltke had written in his introduction to the General Staff's treatise on the War of 1870-71. No operation plan extends with any certainty beyond the first encounter with the main body of the enemy. It is only the layman who, as a campaign develops, thinks he sees the original plan being systematically fulfilled in every detail to its preconceived conclusion. If this thesis did inspire OKH's planning, it meant that the latter reserved the right to decide whether, and by what means, the offensive should be prosecuted once the first objectives, partial victory on the right wing in northern Belgium and the occupation of the Channel coast, were attained. Judging by what I had heard when the operation order was handed to me in Zosen, however, I could only suppose that OKH regarded the chances of achieving decisive results in the French theatre of war as extremely slender, if not non-existent. This impression was later reinforced during the many visits paid to our headquarters by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and his Chief of Staff, neither of whom ever gave any serious attention to our repeated insistence on the need to strive after total victory. Similarly, I doubt if Hitler himself then believed in the possibility of completely eliminating France in the course of the projected operation. Indeed, his primary concern was probably the recollection that when our offensive miscarried in 1914, we had found ourselves lacking even the necessary basis for submarine warfare against Britain. That was why he now attached such importance to winning that basis. In other words, to possession of the Channel coast. Now it was perfectly clear that an operation aiming at the total defeat of France could no longer be executed at one stroke, as Schlieffen had planned to do. As has been explained above, the requisite conditions no longer obtained. Yet if it were proposed, once the partial victory envisaged by OKH had been won, to proceed with a view to eliminating France entirely as an opponent, the present operation had at least to be related to this ultimate goal. In the first place, it had to bring about the total destruction of the enemy's northern wing, in order to establish decisive superiority for the second move, the aim of which would be to annihilate the remaining Western forces in France. In the second place, it had simultaneously to create a favourable strategic situation from which to launch this subsequent thrust. To my mind, the operation as drafted offered no guarantee of fulfilling these two basic requirements. When the German assault formation, Army Group B, which had a total strength of 43 divisions, arrived in Belgium, it would run into 20 Belgian and, if Holland were brought in, a further 10 Dutch divisions. However inferior these troops might be to the Germans in the qualitative sense, their prospects of resistance were favoured by strong fortifications, on both sides of Liège and along the Albert Canal, and natural obstacles, in Belgium the Albert Canal running down to the fortress of Antwerp, and the fortified line of the Meuse pivoted on Namur, in Holland the numerous waterways. Within a very few days, moreover, these forces would be joined by the Anglo-French armies, including all their tank and motorised divisions, already assembled on the Franco-Belgian frontier to meet a German invasion. Thus the German assault wing would have no opportunity, as in 1914, of achieving strategic surprise by a grand-scale outflanking movement. With the arrival of the Anglo-French forces, it would have to fight an opponent as strong as itself, and attack him more or less frontally at that. The success of this first blow must thus be achieved by tactical means, since there was no provision for it in the strategic dispositions for the offensive. Were the enemy to show any skill in his leadership, he might conceivably succeed in evading an outright defeat in Belgium. Even if he did not manage to hold the fortified line Antwerp-Liège-Meuse, or Semois, he must still be expected to get back behind the lower Somme in reasonable order. Once there, he could draw on his powerful reserves to build up a new front. By this time, the German offensive would be losing momentum, and Army Group A would be unable, either by the disposition or the strength of its forces, to prevent the enemy from forming a defence front from the end of the Maginot Line, east of Sedan, to the lower Somme. In this way, the German army would land in a situation similar to that of 1914, at the end of the autumn battles. Its only advantage would be possession of a broader coastal basis along the Channel. Consequently, we should neither have achieved the destruction of the enemy forces in Belgium, which was essential if we were to have adequate superiority in the decisive phase, nor should we have been in a favourable strategic situation for these final battles. The operation planned by OKH would bring partial victory, nothing more. As it turned out, the enemy was overrun wholesale in Belgium in 1940, thanks to the skillful handling of Army Group B, with the result that the Belgian and Dutch armies were forced to capitulate. But however great our trust in German leadership and the striking power of our armour, these were not successes that could be counted upon in advance. Had the other side been better led, the story might have been very different. The utter debacle suffered by the enemy in northern Belgium was almost certainly due to the fact that, as a result of the changes later made to the operation plan, the tank units of Army Group A were able to cut straight through his lines of communication and push him away from the Somme. Finally, there was one other thing that the OKH plan failed to consider: the scope for manoeuvre open to a bold and resolute enemy commander. One had no right to assume that such leadership would be lacking, particularly in view of the reputation General Gamelin enjoyed with us. He had certainly made an excellent impression on General Beck when the latter visited him before the war. A bold enemy commander was in a position to parry the German drive expected through Belgium, and simultaneously to mount a large-scale counter-offensive against the southern flank of the German northern wing. Even when the forces earmarked for support of the Belgians and Dutch had been thrown into Belgium, 50 or 60 divisions for such a counterblow could certainly be found in the Maginot Line, which could easily spare them. The further forward Army Group B advanced in the direction of the English Channel and Somme estuary, the better the enemy command could effect its thrust into the deep flank of the Germans' northern wing. Whether Army Group A, with its 22 divisions, would be strong enough to parry this was by no means certain. Whatever the answer, any developments on these lines would hardly be strategically conducive to a final solution in the Western theatre. The above objections, sketched out as they occurred to me when studying the OKH operation orders, formed the basis of the proposals we set forth in a series of memoranda aimed at bringing the army leaders round to our own point of view. Since these proposals were inevitably somewhat repetitive, I shall merely summarize them here, at the same time indicating where they contrasted with the operational intentions of OKH. The aim of the Western offensive, I submitted, must be to force an issue by land, to strive after the limited objectives set out in the OKH operation. Orders justified neither the political hazards, violation of three countries' neutrality, nor the military stakes involved. The offensive capacity of the German army was our trump card on the continent, and to fritter it away on half measures was inadmissible, if only on account of the Soviet Union. The main weight of our attack must lie with Army Group A, not B. The proposed thrust by Army Group B would hit the waiting enemy more or less frontally. Even if it achieved some initial success, it might well peter out on the Somme. The real chance lay with Army Group A, and consisted in launching a surprise attack through the Ardennes, where the enemy would certainly not be expecting any armour because of the terrain, towards the lower Somme, in order to cut off the enemy forces thrown into Belgium forward of that river. This was the only possible means of destroying the enemy's entire northern wing in Belgium, preparatory to winning a final victory in France. Besides offering the main chance, Army Group A also harboured the main danger for the German offensive. If the enemy acted rightly, he would seek to elude an unfavourable contest in Belgium, possibly by withdrawing behind the Somme. Concurrently, he would deploy all his available forces for a grand counter-offensive against our southern flank, with the aim of surrounding the main body of the German army in Belgium, or forward of the Lower Rhine. Disinclined though one might be to credit the French High Command with such audacity, and certain though France's allies were to oppose so bold a solution, the possibility could still not be discounted. If our offensive through northern Belgium were to halt on the Lower Somme, the enemy would at least succeed in forming an unbroken defensive front with the reserves he had in hand. This front could start at the northwest end of the Maginot Line east of Sedan, and, taking advantage of the Aisne and the Somme, run right down to the Channel. To prevent this, it was vital to smash any enemy concentrations on our southern flank, either on both sides of the Meuse or between the Meuse and Oise, before they could reach completion. The cohesion of the enemy front in this area must be destroyed from the outset with a view to turning the flank of the Maginot Line later on. Army Group A, with which the operation's main effort must lie, even if initially for reasons of space more divisions could be accommodated with Army Group B, must be given 3 armies instead of 2. One army would drive through southern Belgium and across the Meuse as already envisaged, but then it must thrust towards the lower Somme to take the enemy forces facing Army Group B in the rear. Another army must be committed in a southwesterly direction, with the task of taking offensive action against and smashing any enemy forces concentrating west of the Meuse to counterattack against our southern flank. A third army must, as envisaged, cover the deep flank of the overall operation from north of the Maginot Line between Sierck and Mouzon, east of Sedan. In pursuance of this transfer of the main weight of the operation from Army Group B to Army Group A, we duly called for one more army, which, even if it could not be phased in until our offensive was underway, must be available from the very start, and strong armoured forces. These, very much condensed, are the main trends of thought constantly recurring in our Army Group's manifold memoranda to OKH. Naturally, I did not immediately find myself presented with a cut-and-dried operation plan in that October of 1939. Hard work and endeavour must always confront the ordinary mortal before he attains his goal. No ready-made works of art can spring from his brain, as did Pallas Athene from the head of Zeus. Nevertheless, the basic principles of the new plan were contained in the Army Group's very first proposals to OKH, dated 31st October 1939, on operational policy in the event of a German offensive. To be more precise, there were 2 documents involved. The first was a letter from the Army Group commander to the Commander-in-Chief, dealing with the fundamental problem of carrying out a German offensive in the situation at that particular time. Von Rundstedt began by emphasizing that the offensive planned in accordance with the operation orders of 19th and 29th October could not have a decisive effect on the war. The strength of Germany's forces in relation to the enemy's offered no basis for an all-out victory, nor did the operation, being entirely frontal in character, afford any prospect of turning the enemy's flank and taking him in the rear. The probable upshot would be a frontal battle on the Somme. At the same time, Vers Rundstedt pointed to the difficulties opposing the effective use of tanks and aircraft, our ace cards, in autumn and winter. Nevertheless, an offensive must still be launched if its success would create the prerequisites for our fleet and air force to go into action against Britain. The experience of World War I had shown that it was not enough to possess only a part of the Channel coast. We must control the whole North French coastline as far as the Atlantic for this purpose. To expend the offensive capacity of the German army on a limited victory was, with the Soviet Union at our backs, indefensible. This offensive capacity was the decisive factor on the continent, and the friendship of the Soviet Union would be ensured only as long as we had an army capable of offensive action. For the time being, our army's offensive capacity was invested solely in the regular divisions, and would remain so until the new formations had acquired the necessary degree of training and stability. A crucial offensive could not, however, be mounted with regular divisions alone. It might be that the Western powers could be made to take the offensive as the result of pressure by the Luftwaffe on Britain, though even if Britain were to demand such action, it was not at all certain whether French fighting morale would stand up to the bloodletting this must entail. From our point of view, it was desirable that the enemy should himself be saddled with the burden of attacking fortified positions and with the odium of violating Belgian and Dutch neutrality. At the same time, one could not play a waiting game indefinitely and give Britain time to fill in the gaps in her armaments and aircraft production. From the military point of view, the war against Britain could be won only at sea and in the air. It could only be lost on the mainland if the army's offensive capacity were wasted on indecisive battles. Von Rundstedt's letter thus amounted to a warning not to launch any German offensive prematurely, i.e. in the autumn or winter months. In this respect, Army Group A and OKH saw eye to eye. They did not agree, however, on the method to be adopted, and the Army Group commander went on record against conducting the operations, for such was the implication of the OKH operation orders, in a way which did not assure us of conclusive success. Army Group A's second communication to OKH, dated 31st October, and now put in the form of a staff letter, supplemented V. Rundstedt's appreciation by making definite recommendations on how we felt a German offensive should be conducted. This document, which already contained the essentials of the new plan, stressed the necessity of a. Shifting the main weight of the operation as a whole onto the southern wing, b. Committing strong motorized forces in such a manner that they could thrust up from the south into the rear of the Allied troops in northern Belgium, c. Following up with an additional army responsible for warding off, by offensive action, any large-scale counterattack against our southern flank. One could hardly have expected this letter to evoke any response by 3rd November, the date on which we were visited by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and his Chief of Staff, though it did enable me, acting on instructions from Colonel General versus Rundstedt, to state our case direct. Colonel General versus Brauchitsch, however, turned down the request I made for additional forces, the extra army and strong tank units, with the remark that he only wished he could spare them. This made it clear enough that he still entirely refused to accept our point of view. Finally, however, he did promise us an armoured division and 2 motorised regiments from the Army Reserve. Unfortunately, our visitors also made it only too clear that they had strong reservations about the projected offensive in the West, specifically with regard to the chances of winning a decisive victory. Understandably enough, they asked our army and corps commanders to report on the present condition of their formations, but the way they received the complaints, of which there were naturally many, about the state of the newly formed divisions left one with the impression that they personally set no very great store by the offensive. To compensate for this impression, Colonel General versus Rundstedt himself addressed the generals of the Army Group a few days later. By indicating the operational standpoint of his own staff, he showed them that there was actually every prospect of a victorious decision in the West, even if it were not expedient to take the offensive before the spring. On 6th of November, when replying to an OKH request for a statement of our intentions in pursuance of the operation order, we put our recommendations up once again, but received no answer. All this time, Hitler's weather boffins, the Air Ministry meteorologists, were scampering merrily up and down their ladders. Every time they predicted even a brief spell of good weather, Hitler issued the code word for the final troop assemblies. But on each occasion the boffins had to retract and the attack was called off. On 12th November we were taken completely by surprise by the following teleprinter message. The Führer has now directed that a third group of fast-moving troops will be formed on the southern wing of 12th Army, or in the sector allotted to 16th Army, and that this will be directed against Sedan and the area to the east of it, taking advantage of the unwooded terrain on either side of Arlon, Tintigny and Florenville. Composition: HQ 19 Corps, 2 and 10 Panzer Divisions, 1 motorized division, the Leibstandarte and the Grossdeutschland Regiment. The task of this group will be a. To defeat mobile enemy forces thrown into southern Belgium and thereby to lighten the task of 12th and 16th Armies. b. To gain a surprise hold on the west bank of the Meuse by or southeast of Sedan, thereby creating a favourable situation for the subsequent phases of the operation, specifically in the event of the armoured units under command of 6th and 4th Armies proving unsuccessful in their own sectors. The above was followed by an appropriate amplification of the OKH operation order. It was apparent from the wording of the message that this allocation of 19 Corps to Army Group A had been made on Hitler's orders. What had caused him to do this? Possibly he conceived the idea following a recent interview with the commander of 16th Army, General Busch. The latter was acquainted with my views, and may have brought up our wish for armoured forces for a swift drive through the Ardennes. It is also possible that Hitler reached the decision on his own. He had a keen eye for tactical openings and spent much time brooding over maps. He may have realised that the easiest place to cross the Meuse was at Sedan, whereas the armour of Fourth Army further up would find the going much harder. Very likely he had recognised the Meuse crossing at Sedan as a promising spot, in the sense that it offered an opening on the river for the southern wing of Army Group A, and wanted, as he always did, to go for every tempting objective at once. In practice, pleased though we were at acquiring the Panzer Corps, it still entailed dispersing our armour, and for that reason the commander of 19 Panzer Corps, General Guderian, was at first none too happy about his formation's new role, his contention having always been that tanks should be used to punch hard at one place at a time. Only when I had briefed him on our army group's operational motives for seeking to shift the main weight of the entire offensive to the southern wing, and drawn his attention to the alluring target of the Somme estuary in the enemy's rear, did Guderian show unbounded enthusiasm for our plan. Ultimately, it was his élan which inspired our tanks on their dash round the backs of the enemy to the Channel coast. For me, of course, it was a great relief to know that my idea of pushing large numbers of tanks through such difficult country as the Ardennes was considered feasible by Guderian. To come back once more to the allocation of 19 Panzer Corps, there is no doubt that Hitler envisaged it only as a tactical measure which would at the same time facilitate Army Group B's own crossing of the Meuse. Nor did OKH's amplification to its operation order include any reference to setting new objectives.